There are moments in the history of life on this planet so vast, so complete, so overwhelmingly alive that the human mind struggles to contain them. Moments when the Earth was not the quiet, measured world we know today, but something wilder, louder, more dangerous, and more breathtaking than anything our imaginations can conjure without the help of science. 66 million years ago, this planet was one of those moments. The land breathed differently. The air tasted different. The light that fell through the canopy of enormous trees landed on creatures that no living human eye has ever seen walking, feeding, hunting, or sleeping beneath an open sky. And yet we know they were there. We know because they left their bones behind. They left their footprints pressed into ancient mud that turned to stone over unimaginable lengths of time. They left their teeth, their scales, their nests, and the outlines of their lives fossilized in the rock layers of our world like letters written in a language that scientists have spent centuries learning to read. This is the story of that world, not the simplified version, not the version where the dinosaurs were already dying before the end came, not the Hollywood version where the monsters simply tear each other apart until nothing is left. This is the true story, as best as science can now tell it, of a living, breathing, thriving planet that was interrupted by one of the most catastrophic events in the history of the solar system. A story that begins long before the catastrophe and ends long after it, carrying within it lessons about resilience, about the nature of ecosystems, about what it means for life to build something magnificent and then lose it in what amounts, geologically speaking, to the blink of an eye. To understand the end, you must first understand what existed before the end. You must appreciate the world that was lost before you can begin to comprehend the scale of what happened when it was taken away. And so we begin not with destruction, but with creation. Not with the last moment, but with the long, extraordinary age that preceded it. We begin 66 million years ago, in a world so different from our own that it might as well be another planet. And yet it was this planet, turning on its axis, circling the same sun, holding the same ocean water, breathing the same basic atmospheric chemistry, just arranged in a completely different configuration, populated by a completely different cast of living characters. And operating under ecological rules that had been refined and tested over the course of more than 160 million years of dinosaur evolution. 160 million years. Let that number settle for a moment. If you were to compress all of human civilization, from the first cities built in ancient Mesopotamia to the present day, into a single day on a clock, then the reign of the dinosaurs on this earth would span roughly the equivalent of 3 months. They were not a brief experiment, they were not a passing phase. They were the dominant architecture of terrestrial life on this planet for an almost incomprehensibly long period of time, and by the time we arrive at the late Cretaceous period, which is where our story begins in earnest, they had achieved something remarkable. They had built ecosystems of staggering complexity, sophistication, and balance. Ecosystems that had been tested by smaller fluctuations and lesser challenges, and had, time and again, demonstrated their resilience. The late Cretaceous in what is now the western interior of the landmass we call North America was a place of extraordinary richness. The geography alone would have been barely recognizable to a modern observer. The great mountain ranges were younger and more active than they are today, their peaks sharper and more dramatic, their volcanic activity more frequent. Running down the center of the continent was a shallow inland sea, the Western Interior Seaway, a warm, productive body of water that effectively divided the landmass into 2 separate pieces, creating distinct evolutionary pressures on the populations of animals on either side. To the west of this seaway, a lowland coastal plain stretched from the base of the mountains to the water's edge, and it was this coastal plain, lush and warm and perpetually productive, that served as the primary stage for the drama we are about to explore. The climate of the late Cretaceous was not like the climate of our time. The planet was warmer in ways that were fundamental and consistent. There were no polar ice caps of any significant size. The poles themselves, while cooler than the tropics, were not the frozen wastelands we know today. They were forested in some seasons with trees that had adapted to the long months of polar darkness. but the temperate and tropical regions of the world were profoundly, almost lushly warm. Temperatures were higher on average, and the distribution of that warmth was different, creating a planet where the contrast between equatorial heat and polar cold was less dramatic than it is in our current world. This meant that weather patterns, ocean currents, and atmospheric circulation operated differently, creating conditions that, in many regions, produced reliable, consistent rainfall and a growing season that was essentially perpetual. For the ecosystems of the late Cretaceous coastal plain, this meant abundance. It meant forests of a kind that no longer exist in exactly the same form, forests dominated by conifers and ferns, but increasingly, by this late stage of the Cretaceous, also populated by the earliest flowering plants, the angiosperms, whose rapid evolutionary radiation during the Cretaceous was changing the entire character of terrestrial plant communities around the world. The forests were dense and multi-layered. Tall conifers formed a high canopy that caught the upper light, while beneath them, a complex understory of smaller plants competed for the filtered illumination that reached the ground. Along the margins of rivers and floodplains, vegetation was particularly lush, nourished by the constant moisture and the nutrient-rich sediments deposited by regular flooding. These riparian corridors were arteries of life, highways along which animals moved and along whose banks the density and diversity of living things reached its greatest expression. To walk through this landscape would have been an almost overwhelming sensory experience. The sounds alone would have been unlike anything a modern person has ever heard. The calls of the pterosaurs that still ruled the skies, the low, resonant vocalizations of large herbivores communicating across distances, the constant background chorus of insects, which by this point in Earth's history had already achieved a remarkable diversity of their own. The smells would have been rich with decomposition and growth, with the chemical signatures of plants broadcasting their presence, with the warm, humid air carrying the scent of water and mud and living things in every direction. And the visual spectacle would have been unlike anything our world can offer today, because moving through this landscape, feeding on its plants, hunting one another, raising their young, and going about the daily business of survival were the dinosaurs. They were everywhere. They filled every available ecological niche on land with a thoroughness and diversity that is genuinely astonishing when you begin to catalog it. At the base of the food web, processing the enormous quantities of plant material that the productive late Cretaceous landscape generated, were the great herbivores. And the herbivores of this time and place were not a single, homogeneous group of plant-eating giants. They were a diverse assemblage of animals that had evolved to exploit different aspects of the available plant resources, a phenomenon that ecologists call niche partitioning, and which is one of the hallmarks of a mature, stable ecosystem. The ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs, were among the most spectacular of these herbivores. Triceratops, the most familiar representative of this group, was a creature of impressive proportions, a heavily built animal that could reach lengths of around 9 meters and weights estimated at anywhere between 6 and 12 metric tons depending on the individual. The 3 horns that gave the group its name, 2 long brow horns that could reach impressive lengths and a shorter nose horn, were not simply defensive weapons, though they certainly served that function. They were also likely social signaling devices, used in communication and display within the species, much as the antlers of modern deer serve both combat and display functions. The frill that extended behind the skull, a bony structure faced with skin that was probably colorful in life, added to the animal's already dramatic appearance and provided both protection for the neck and additional surface area for display. But what is perhaps more interesting than the physical spectacle of Triceratops is what its anatomy tells us about its ecological role. The structure of its jaws and teeth reveals an animal that was a highly efficient processor of tough, fibrous vegetation. The dental battery, consisting of hundreds of teeth arranged in tightly packed rows that functioned as a continuous cutting surface, was capable of reducing plant material that other animals might have found impossible to process. Triceratops and its relatives were likely feeding on tough, low-growing vegetation, palms, ferns, and the shrubby angiosperms that were colonizing the lower levels of the landscape. They were, in ecological terms, bulldozers, capable of processing plant material that required a significant amount of mechanical processing before the nutrients within it could be extracted. Alongside the ceratopsians, the hadrosaurs represented an entirely different approach to the challenge of surviving as a large herbivore. These were the duck-billed dinosaurs, named for the broad, flat snouts that characterized the group, and they were among the most successful and diverse of all dinosaur groups in the late Cretaceous. Where the ceratopsians were built for processing tough, low-growing plants with brute mechanical force, the hadrosaurs were more generalist browsers, capable of feeding at a range of heights and on a wider variety of plant material. Their dental batteries were similarly impressive, but their jaws worked differently, and the range of plant types they could exploit was broader. The hadrosaurs were also, by the evidence of their fossils and the trackways they left behind, highly social animals. They moved in herds, possibly large ones, and the social complexity of these herds may have been considerable. Some species possessed elaborate cranial crests, hollow structures that were almost certainly used for acoustic signaling, allowing individuals to communicate across distances and giving the herd a means of coordination that would have been crucial both for predator detection and for the management of movement through a landscape where resources were distributed unevenly. Imagine, if you can, a herd of hadrosaurs moving through the late Cretaceous forest, their crests carrying their calls through the trees, each individual's attention partly focused outward on the possibility of danger, the group as a whole functioning as a distributed sensing and response system of remarkable sophistication. But the herbivores were not alone in their exploitation of the plant resources of the late Cretaceous. The ankylosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, occupied yet another niche, low-browsing specialists protected by their extraordinary dermal armor from predators that might otherwise have found them easy targets. The ankylosaurs were not fast animals. They did not need to be. Their armor, consisting of embedded plates and spikes of bone covered by tough skin, made them effectively invulnerable to most threats from above and to the sides. The tail club that many species possessed, a massive bony structure capable of delivering a blow that could shatter bone, provided defense against threats from behind. These were not animals that needed to run. They were animals that needed to survive in place, and their anatomy made them extraordinarily good at doing exactly that. Consider the diversity of just these three groups of large herbivores, the ceratopsians, hadrosaurs, and ankylosaurs, and you begin to get a sense of the ecological richness of the late Cretaceous landscape. These were not interchangeable plant eaters competing for the same resources. They were specialists, each exploiting a different aspect of the plant community, each filling a role that the others did not fully overlap with. This kind of niche partitioning, this careful division of the available resources among a diverse array of consumers, is one of the signatures of a mature, stable ecosystem, one that has had sufficient time to achieve a kind of equilibrium in which competition between species has been reduced by specialization. And then there were the predators. If the herbivores of the late Cretaceous were impressive in their diversity and their specialization, the predators were impressive in a different way, in the sheer concentrated power of their evolutionary achievement. At the apex of the predator community in the late Cretaceous of western North America stood an animal that has become one of the most iconic creatures in the entire history of life on Earth, Tyrannosaurus rex. The name itself has become so familiar, so deeply embedded in popular culture, that it requires a conscious effort to strip away the accumulated mythology and see the animal clearly, as science now understands it, not as a movie monster, but as a real, living creature that occupied a specific place in a specific ecosystem and performed specific ecological functions that were essential to the health of that system. Tyrannosaurus was enormous. that much of the popular image is accurate. Adult individuals could reach lengths of 12 to 13 meters, stand perhaps 4 meters at the hip, and weigh somewhere in the range of 8 to 14 metric tons, making them among the largest terrestrial predators that have ever existed. The skull alone could be over 1.5 meters in length, a massive, heavily built structure that housed jaws of extraordinary power. The teeth of Tyrannosaurus were not the knife-like blades of many other theropod predators. They were thick, robust, banana-shaped teeth, designed not for slicing but for crushing, capable of exerting bite forces that have been estimated as among the highest of any terrestrial predator in Earth's history. These teeth could bite through bone, a capability that is rare among predators and that gave Tyrannosaurus access to a resource, the marrow within the bones of its prey, that most other predators could not exploit. But the biology of Tyrannosaurus has been the subject of intense scientific investigation over the past several decades, and what has emerged from that investigation is a picture far more nuanced and interesting than the simple monster of popular imagination. The question of how Tyrannosaurus moved has been particularly contentious. Early reconstructions portrayed it as a fast, agile pursuit predator. More recent biomechanical analyses, taking into account the animal's enormous mass and the structural limitations of its skeleton, suggest a more moderate picture. Tyrannosaurus was probably not capable of the extreme running speeds of popular imagination, but it was not a slow, lumbering creature either. It was capable of sustained, efficient locomotion at speeds that would have been adequate for dealing with the large herbivores that constituted its prey. And the prey of Tyrannosaurus was, by the evidence of the fossil record, primarily the large herbivores of its ecosystem, the ceratopsians and hadrosaurs that shared its landscape. Healed bite marks on the bones of these animals, wounds that the animals survived and recovered from, tell us that Tyrannosaurus and its prey were engaged in an ongoing, dynamic relationship, one in which the outcome was not predetermined and in which both predator and prey were constantly being shaped by their interaction. The prey animal's defensive adaptations, the horns of the ceratopsians, the crest signaling systems of the hadrosaurs, the armored protection of the ankylosaurs, were all in some sense evolutionary responses to the pressure exerted by predators like Tyrannosaurus over millions of years of coevolution. This is the ecological concept that is perhaps most important to understand about Tyrannosaurus and other apex predators in the late Cretaceous, the concept of the keystone species. A keystone species in ecological terms is one whose impact on its ecosystem is disproportionately large relative to its abundance. Remove the keystone species, and the ecosystem changes fundamentally, often in ways that cascade through the entire system in ways that are difficult to predict in their specifics, but tend in their general direction toward a collapse of diversity and complexity. Apex predators like Tyrannosaurus function as keystone species precisely because their influence on the behavior and population dynamics of their prey is so profound. In a world with Tyrannosaurus, the large herbivores were under constant selective pressure to remain vigilant, to remain in groups, to develop better warning systems and better defensive adaptations. This pressure shaped their behavior in ways that had cascading effects throughout the ecosystem. Herbivore populations that were regulated by predation pressure were less likely to overgraze any particular area of the landscape, because the need to remain alert and mobile, to avoid becoming easy targets for predators, prevented them from settling too long in any one location and stripping its plant resources down to bare ground. The movement of large herbivore herds through the landscape, shaped by predator pressure, was itself an ecological process, a form of landscape management that influenced the distribution and diversity of plant communities. Tyrannosaurus was not alone in the predator community of the late Cretaceous. Smaller tyrannosaurs had preceded it in the evolutionary lineage, and even in the final stage of the Cretaceous, there were other predators that occupied different niches within the predator guild. Smaller theropods, distant relatives of the birds that were even then diversifying into the roles that their descendants would come to occupy across the modern world, were pursuing smaller prey, filling the mesopredator niche that exists in all healthy, diverse ecosystems. These animals, some of them possibly quite bird-like in their behavior and appearance, some of them already possessing feathers in the way that we now know many theropod dinosaurs did, were participants in their own complex web of predator-prey relationships at the smaller end of the size spectrum. The picture that emerges when you stand back and try to take in the entire ecosystem of the late Cretaceous North American coastal plain is not one of a world on the edge of collapse. It is not a world in which the great dinosaurs are struggling, failing, declining toward an inevitable end. It is a world in full operation, a world functioning with the kind of complex, self-reinforcing stability that is the product of millions of years of ecological refinement. Every element of this ecosystem was connected to every other element through webs of interaction, so intricate that they would take entire careers of scientific study to fully map. The plants shaped the herbivores. The herbivores shaped the plants, the predators shaped the herbivores shaped the predators. The climate shaped everything, and everything in its collective respiratory and metabolic activity shaped the climate in small but real ways. This was not a fragile world. It was a robust, resilient world that had survived challenges before. The late Cretaceous was not the first time in Earth's history that ecosystems had faced disruption. Volcanic eruptions, climate fluctuations, sea level changes, and smaller bolide impacts had all, at various points in the preceding millions of years, posed challenges to the established order of life on Earth. And the established order had each time absorbed those challenges, adapted, and continued. The survivors of previous disruptions had rebuilt their communities, and the communities that had been rebuilt had, over time, achieved new levels of complexity and diversity. Life on Earth was, by the late Cretaceous, extraordinarily good at surviving disruption. It had been practicing for billions of years, but what was coming was something different, something on a scale that lay outside the range of what any ecosystem, however robust, however well practiced in resilience, had ever been required to cope with. Something so sudden and so complete in its devastation that the normal mechanisms of ecological resilience, the ability of populations to recover, the ability of generalist species to fill the roles left empty by specialists, the ability of the food web to reconfigure itself around new resource bases, were simply not adequate to the task. The approaching catastrophe was not a challenge that the ecosystem could absorb and adapt to. It was a reset. A complete and total rewriting of the conditions under which life on Earth would have to operate, and it came without warning. There was no precursor that a triceratops grazing on the floodplain would have noticed, no gradual darkening of the sky over weeks or months that might have caused the hadrosaur herds to shift their behavior in anticipation. No slowly increasing stress on the plant communities that might have cascaded through the food web in a way that large predators like Tyrannosaurus would have experienced as a gradual diminishment of their prey base. There was, by all the evidence that the fossil record and the geological record provide, essentially nothing. And then there was everything at once. Before we arrive at that moment, however, there is more of the flourishing world to explore. There is more to understand about the ecosystem that was lost, because the more completely we understand what existed, the more accurately we can appreciate what was destroyed, and the more clearly we can trace the chain of consequences that unfolded in the aftermath. So let us continue our exploration of the late Cretaceous world, moving beyond the charismatic megafauna, beyond the Tyrannosaurus and the Triceratops, and looking at the full complexity of life at every level of the ecosystem. The rivers and waterways of the late Cretaceous landscape were extraordinary environments in their own right. The western interior seaway that bisected the continent was not simply a body of open water. It was a complex marine ecosystem, teeming with its own characteristic assemblage of predators and prey. Mosasaurs, large marine reptiles that had evolved from terrestrial lizard ancestors, occupied the role of apex marine predator in the seaway, their streamlined bodies and powerful tails making them formidable hunters in the warm, productive waters. Plesiosaurs, with their long necks and flippered bodies, shared these waters, pursuing fish and other marine prey with a hunting strategy that was quite different from that of the mosasaurs. And beneath both of these large predators, the waters teemed with fish, with ammonites, with marine invertebrates of countless kinds, all participants in a marine food web of considerable complexity. Along the shores of the seaway and in the rivers and lakes of the coastal plain, other animals occupied the transitional zone between aquatic and terrestrial environments. Large crocodilians, some of them substantially larger than any crocodilian alive today, lurked in the waterways, opportunistic predators that took whatever prey came within reach. Turtles of numerous species inhabited both freshwater and brackish environments, and the rivers themselves supported diverse fish communities, including large, predatory species that would have been dominant players in the freshwater food web. Above all of this in the air, the pterosaurs still soared, though by the end of the Cretaceous they had been somewhat displaced from the smaller aerial niches by the rapidly diversifying birds. The pterosaurs that remained were, in many cases, extraordinary creatures, some of them achieving wingspans that rank them among the largest flying animals that have ever existed. Quetzalcoatlus, the largest of these late Cretaceous pterosaurs, is estimated to have had a wingspan of up to 10 or 11 meters, comparable to a small aircraft, making it a dominant aerial presence over the late Cretaceous landscape. These animals may have functioned as aerial scavengers, using their size and their ability to soar on thermals to range over vast areas of landscape in search of carcasses, playing a role somewhat analogous to that of condors in modern ecosystems. The birds themselves, by the late Cretaceous, were already a diverse and ecologically significant group. They were not the highly derived, highly varied birds of the modern world, but they occupied a range of ecological roles that their descendants would later expand dramatically. Some were aquatic, diving for fish. Others were terrestrial, feeding on seeds or insects. Their diversity and their ecological integration into the late Cretaceous ecosystem is an important part of the story, because birds, as the avian descendants of theropod dinosaurs, are the representatives of the dinosaur lineage that survived the catastrophe. Understanding their late Cretaceous ecology helps illuminate why this particular group of dinosaurs was able to survive when all others perished. The insects of the late Cretaceous were, in terms of both diversity and ecological importance, a crucial component of the ecosystem. By this point in Earth's history, the great radiation of flowering plants had created an extraordinary range of new niches for insect species, and the insects had responded to this opportunity with an equally extraordinary diversification. Pollinators of many kinds were forging the mutualistic relationships with flowering plants that have since become one of the fundamental organizing principles of terrestrial ecosystems. Detritivores were performing the essential service of breaking down dead organic matter and returning its nutrients to the soil. Predatory insects were regulating populations of other insects. And insects at every level of this complex community were serving as food resources for animals at higher trophic levels, from small lizards and early mammals to the smallest of the theropod dinosaurs. The mammals of the late Cretaceous deserve special mention, not because they were particularly prominent members of the ecosystem at this time, but because they were there and because their subsequent history is so intimately connected to the catastrophe we are approaching. By the late Cretaceous, mammals had been evolving for more than 100 million years, having originated in the Triassic period from a lineage of mammal-like reptiles. But throughout the age of dinosaurs, they had remained, for the most part, small, nocturnal, and ecologically marginal. Constrained by competition from the dominant dinosaurian fauna, they had been unable to diversify into the full range of ecological roles that their descendants would eventually occupy. They were, in a sense, waiting. Occupying the cracks and margins of an ecosystem thoroughly dominated by a very different kind of vertebrate. These late Cretaceous mammals were, with a few exceptions, small creatures, mostly in the range of modern mice and rats, though a few species reached somewhat larger sizes. They were predominantly nocturnal, their sensory systems adapted for activity in conditions of low light, a heritage of their long experience as creatures of the margins, forced into the night hours by the activity of larger, diurnally dominant dinosaurian competitors. They ate insects, seeds, and small vertebrates. They reproduced relatively quickly compared to the large dinosaurs. And they carried within their biology the seeds of the future, the capability for the kind of rapid adaptive radiation that would, in the aftermath of catastrophe, allow them to expand into the ecological void left by the disappearance of the dinosaurs. But in the late Cretaceous, they were peripheral, background characters in an ecological drama dominated by the great dinosaurs. The ecosystem belonged, in every meaningful sense, to the reptiles, to the dinosaurs and their relatives, and it had belonged to them for so long and so thoroughly that imagining it any other way would have required a truly radical shift in perspective. There was nothing about the world of the late Cretaceous that suggested it was about to change. Nothing in the behavior of the animals, nothing in the growth patterns of the plants, nothing in the chemistry of the atmosphere or the temperature of the oceans, nothing in any of the signals that an ecologist might use to detect a system under stress, suggested that the magnificent complexity of the late Cretaceous world was about to be undone. The fossil record from the very end of the Cretaceous, the last few 100,000 years before the catastrophe, actually shows something quite striking in its implications. The diversity of dinosaur species was not declining in the final phase of the Cretaceous. The number of dinosaur genera known from the last stage of the period, the Maastrichtian, is comparable to the diversity known from earlier stages. The argument that dinosaurs were in decline before the end of the Cretaceous, that they were already failing and the asteroid impact simply administered the coup de grace to a lineage that was already doomed, is not supported by the most careful analysis of the fossil data. What the fossil data shows instead is a healthy, diverse, functioning ecosystem that was continuing to evolve and diversify right up to the moment it was destroyed. This point matters because it changes the nature of the story we are telling. If the dinosaurs had been declining, if the ecosystem had been in trouble before the catastrophe, then the story of the end Cretaceous extinction would be, in some sense, a story of inevitable failure of a group of organisms that had run its evolutionary course and was being replaced by better adapted successors. But that is not what happened. What happened was something far more abrupt and far more dramatic. A thriving world was not replaced, it was obliterated, and obliterated so suddenly that the organisms that survived were not, in most cases, the organisms that were best adapted to whatever came next. They were primarily the organisms that happened to have certain characteristics that allowed them to survive the immediate catastrophe and the brutal conditions that immediately followed it. Understanding this distinction, the difference between a gradual succession and an abrupt catastrophic replacement, is fundamental to understanding the history of life on Earth and the patterns of extinction and recovery that have shaped the biosphere we inhabit today. And it is a distinction that the geological record makes with remarkable clarity, in the form of a thin, precise, globally distributed layer of sediment that marks the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene periods. Before we arrive at that boundary layer and what it tells us, let us linger a little longer in the world that preceded it, because there is something deeply worth contemplating in the sheer longevity and the sheer success of the world that was lost. We have been talking about the late Cretaceous as though it were a single snapshot, a fixed tableau of predators and prey arranged in a static relationship with one another. But of course, it was not that. It was a living system, and living systems are never static. Even within the framework of the stable, diverse late Cretaceous ecosystem, change was constant. Populations fluctuated, species evolved, local environments changed in response to geological processes, to river course changes, to the gradual transgression and regression of the seaway, to the episodic volcanic activity of the young mountains to the west. These ongoing changes were, in ecological terms, disturbances, events that disrupted the local equilibrium and required the ecosystem to respond and reorganize. And the ecosystem did respond and reorganize time and again, demonstrating the kind of functional resilience that is the hallmark of a mature, well-connected ecological community. After a volcanic eruption laid down a layer of ash that temporarily disrupted local plant communities, the vegetation recovered, and with it the herbivore populations that depended on it, and with them the predator populations that depended on the herbivores. After a period of drought that reduced the productivity of a particular region, the animals moved, tracked the moisture to where it remained, and the ecosystem adjusted to the altered distribution of resources. After a flood that scoured a river channel and buried communities of organisms in silt, the survivors recolonized the disturbed area, and the local food web rebuilt itself from the bottom up. This is how ecosystems work. They are not fragile crystalline structures that shatter at the first touch of disturbance. They are dynamic systems with built-in redundancy, with multiple species capable of performing similar ecological functions, with mechanisms for recovery and reorganization that can respond to a wide range of perturbation. And the late Cretaceous ecosystem had been tested by perturbation of many kinds over many millions of years. It had responded and recovered again and again with the kind of robust adaptability that should have made it capable of surviving virtually anything. Virtually anything, but not everything. There was in the solar system around our planet a piece of rock and metal whose eventual collision with Earth had been determined by orbital mechanics, by the gravitational mathematics of planetary motion and asteroid trajectory, long before there were any dinosaurs to threaten. Its path and the path of the Earth had been converging for a very long time, in the sense that the perturbations that had eventually nudged it into its planet-crossing orbit had occurred long before the Cretaceous, long before the age of dinosaurs, perhaps long before the appearance of complex multicellular life on Earth. It was not aimed at anything. It was not purposeful. It was simply an object moving through space according to the same physical laws that govern all such motion, and its path happened, on a particular day 66 million years ago, to intersect with the path of the third planet from the Sun. The object was large. Current best estimates, derived from the size of the crater it created and from the global distribution of the material it scattered, suggest a diameter of approximately 10 to 15 kilometers. In human terms, this is an enormous object, larger than many mountain ranges, larger than any island that a human civilization has built a city on. In astronomical terms, it is actually quite small, a modest fragment of the larger story of solar system formation and evolution. But in terms of its impact on the specific fragile living layer that coats the surface of the Earth, it was sufficient to do something that nothing else of natural origin had done in the history of complex multicellular life, to reset the entire terrestrial ecosystem of the planet. But before we reach the moment of impact, before we arrive at the geological evidence that documents what happened and the scientific story of how that evidence was interpreted, let us look more carefully at one more aspect of the late Cretaceous world that is crucial to understanding both what was lost and why it was lost. Let us look at the specific relationship between the structure of the ecosystem and its vulnerability to the kind of catastrophe that was approaching. Large animals in general are more vulnerable to sudden environmental catastrophe than small animals. This is not because large animals are inherently less well adapted than small ones. On the contrary, the large animals of the late Cretaceous, the Tyrannosaurus, the Triceratops, the Hadrosaurs and Ankylosaurs, were magnificently well adapted to the conditions of their world. They were the products of millions of years of evolutionary refinement, each of their characteristics honed by natural selection to maximize fitness in the specific ecological context in which they lived. The problem with large body size is not adaptational. It is metabolic and demographic. Large animals require large amounts of food. A Tyrannosaurus, to maintain its enormous body mass and fuel whatever level of metabolic activity it maintained, whether it was more bird-like in its warm-bloodedness or more reptile-like in its metabolic rate, which remains a subject of scientific discussion, required a substantial food input. This meant that it required access to large prey animals in sufficient numbers to meet its energy needs. Remove the prey or reduce the prey population below some threshold and the predator population collapses. There is no reserve of stored energy that can sustain a 12 metric ton predator through an extended period of food scarcity. The animal either eats or it dies. The same principle applies to the large herbivores. A triceratops required enormous quantities of plant material to sustain itself. An ecosystem that could no longer produce that plant material, or that produced it only in quantities insufficient to support large herbivore populations, was an ecosystem in which triceratops could not survive. And this is precisely the vulnerability that the approaching catastrophe would exploit, not by directly killing the large animals of the Cretaceous, though some of them certainly died directly in the immediate aftermath of the impact, but by destroying the plant communities on which the entire food web depended, removing the energetic foundation on which the entire magnificent structure of the late Cretaceous ecosystem rested. Small animals, by contrast, have lower absolute energy requirements. A mouse can survive on a fraction of the food that an elephant needs. In conditions of severe resource scarcity, small animals can often find enough to eat even when the total availability of food in the environment has been dramatically reduced. They can eat different things, switch between food sources with an opportunistic flexibility that specialized large animals cannot match. They can survive on reserves that would be nutritionally meaningless to a large animal. And they can reproduce quickly, rebuilding their populations after periods of high mortality with a speed that large animals, with their long generation times and small litter sizes, simply cannot match. This difference in body size and its associated differences in energy requirements, reproductive rates, and ecological flexibility explains much of the pattern of survival and extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, but it is not the whole story. Body size alone is not a perfect predictor of survival. The pattern of extinction was more nuanced than a simple large-small divide, and understanding the nuances requires looking at the specific ways in which the catastrophe unfolded and the specific ways in which different groups of organisms were affected by each stage of the unfolding disaster. Before we can do that, however, we need to examine the evidence. We need to look at what the geological record actually shows about the end of the Cretaceous, because the story of how scientists came to understand this event is itself a remarkable story, one that involves the intersection of multiple disciplines, the overturning of established scientific consensus, and the gradual accumulation of evidence from sites around the world that all point to the same extraordinary conclusion. For most of the history of geology as a scientific discipline, the prevailing view of the end Cretaceous extinction was that it had been gradual. Gradual was, in fact, the default assumption about most major geological transitions, because the entire framework of geological science had been built on the principle of uniformitarianism, the idea that the geological and biological changes we see recorded in the rock layers were the product of the same slow, steady processes we can observe operating in the world today. In this framework, catastrophic events that produced dramatic and rapid change, were viewed with suspicion. They smacked of the pre-scientific worldview of floods and divine interventions. The serious scientist was supposed to explain the world in terms of gradual, continuous processes, not sudden, violent ones. In this intellectual context, the extinction of the dinosaurs was interpreted as the result of gradual environmental change, a slow cooling of the climate, a change in the composition of plant communities that disadvantaged the large herbivores, a progressive deterioration of the conditions that had supported the great dinosaurian fauna over millions of years. The fossil record, which showed a transition from dinosaur-bearing layers to mammal-bearing layers, was interpreted as evidence of a gradual replacement rather than a sudden catastrophe. And this interpretation had a certain intuitive appeal, because it fit within the established framework of how science understood the world. But there was a problem with this interpretation, and the problem became increasingly apparent as the techniques for studying the geological record became increasingly sophisticated. The problem was the precision of the transition. In rock section after rock section around the world, wherever the boundary between Cretaceous and Paleogene sediments was exposed, the same pattern appeared. Below a certain level, dinosaur fossils were present, along with the full complement of Cretaceous fauna. Above that level, they were absent, and the transition between these two states was not spread over millions of years of gradually changing stratigraphy. It was concentrated at a precise, thin horizon, sometimes just a few centimeters thick, sometimes even thinner, a boundary that you could put your finger on. The significance of this precision was not lost on careful observers, but it was not until a specific chemical discovery in the 1970s that the full implications of the boundary became impossible to ignore. A geologist named Walter Alvarez, working with his physicist father Luis Alvarez, was studying a section of rock in the Apennine Mountains of Italy that beautifully exposed the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. As part of their investigation, they had the sediment at and around the boundary analyzed for its chemical composition. And in the thin clay layer that marked the boundary itself, they found something startling, an anomaly that changed the scientific understanding of Earth's history forever. The anomaly was iridium. Iridium is a heavy metallic element that is extraordinarily rare in the rocks of Earth's crust. The reason for its rarity is that, when the Earth formed and was in a molten state early in its history, the heavy elements like iridium sank toward the center, concentrating in the core rather than remaining in the crust. So terrestrial rocks have very little iridium. Meteorites, however, have much more because they are fragments of the early solar system that were never subjected to the same differentiation process as the Earth. They retain their original primordial chemical composition, including elevated concentrations of iridium. The thin clay layer at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary was enriched in iridium at concentrations 30 times higher than the background level of the surrounding rocks. This enrichment was not a local anomaly. As the Alvarez team and then many other researchers checked boundary sections around the world, the same iridium anomaly appeared everywhere in every section where the boundary was clearly exposed. A global signature of extraordinary chemical specificity, concentrated in a layer of rock that was precisely coincident with the extinction of the dinosaurs. The Alvarez team's interpretation of this anomaly was audacious, and to many of their colleagues, deeply controversial. They proposed that the iridium had been delivered by a large extraterrestrial impactor, an asteroid of sufficient size to distribute its material globally when it vaporized on impact with the Earth's surface. The impact, they argued, was the cause of the end Cretaceous extinction, not a gradual environmental change, not a slow ecological transition, a single catastrophic impact event. The reaction from the scientific community was initially skeptical. The idea of a sudden catastrophic extinction caused by an asteroid impact seemed to many scientists like a return to the pre-scientific worldview, catastrophism dressed up in modern language. Alternative explanations for the iridium anomaly were proposed, including massive volcanic activity, which can also produce iridium enrichment through the eruption of deep mantle material. And critics pointed to what they saw as weaknesses in the Alvarez hypothesis, including the then still unclear question of where the impact had actually occurred, since no crater of the right age and size had yet been identified. But the evidence continued to accumulate. In addition to iridium, researchers found other chemical signatures in the boundary layer that were consistent with a massive impact and inconsistent with the alternative explanations. Shocked quartz, a form of the mineral that can only be produced under the extreme pressures generated by hypervelocity impact or by nuclear explosions, was found in boundary sections around the world. Glass spherules, tiny droplets of molten rock that had been blasted into the atmosphere and had cooled into glass as they fell back to Earth, were found in the boundary layer. The combination of these multiple, independent lines of chemical and physical evidence, all pointing to the same conclusion and all concentrated at the same precise stratigraphic horizon, was becoming increasingly difficult to explain by any mechanism other than a large impact. And then, in the early 1990s, the missing piece was found. Buried beneath the waters and the sediments of the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, geologists identified a buried structure of the right age, the right size, and the right characteristics to be the source of all the evidence that had been accumulating in boundary sections around the world. The Chicxulub crater, as it came to be known, is approximately 180 kilometers in diameter, making it one of the largest confirmed impact craters on Earth. It is buried beneath kilometers of sediment deposited in the millions of years since the impact, invisible at the surface, but detectable through geophysical techniques and through core samples that penetrate to the impact layer and reveal the characteristic shocked and melted rocks of a massive hypervelocity impact. The discovery of Chicxulub transformed the Alvarez impact hypothesis from a controversial proposal into the dominant scientific explanation for the end Cretaceous extinction. It did not silence all debate. There remained, and to some extent still remain, questions about the precise contribution of the impact versus the contemporaneous massive volcanic eruptions in what is now India, the Deccan Traps, which were producing enormous quantities of lava and volcanic gases in the same general time period. But the fundamental conclusion that the end of the Cretaceous was marked by a massive extraterrestrial impact that was the primary driver of the extinction is now accepted by the overwhelming majority of the scientific community. The impact itself, when reconstructed from the geological evidence, was an event of almost incomprehensible violence. An object approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter, traveling at a velocity estimated at perhaps 20 kilometers per second, struck the Earth's surface in what is now the northern Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. At that velocity, the kinetic energy of the impactor was equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The impact was not a simple collision. It was a process that unfolded in a matter of seconds and involved physics at scales and energies that have no analog in ordinary human experience. In the first fraction of a second of the impact, the asteroid and the target rocks were compressed to pressures millions of times greater than atmospheric pressure. The energy of this compression could not be stored. It was released instantly and explosively as heat, as pressure waves, and as the violent ejection of material from the impact site. The asteroid itself was essentially vaporized. The rocks of the target area, hundreds of cubic kilometers of limestone and evaporite sediments that formed the geology of the Yucatan Peninsula, were vaporized, melted, and ejected. The crater that formed in the following seconds was enormous, many kilometers deep and eventually, after collapse, approximately 180 kilometers in diameter. The material ejected from the crater was distributed in multiple ways. The finest material, vaporized rock and the remains of the asteroid itself, was lofted into the upper atmosphere and distributed globally by atmospheric circulation. The coarser material, the rock fragments and glass spherules, followed ballistic trajectories, some falling back to Earth near the impact site in a rain of red-hot debris, others traveling on high arcing paths that carried them thousands of kilometers before they re-entered the atmosphere and fell to Earth. The iridium, the shocked quartz, the glass spherules that researchers have found in boundary layers around the world are the physical record of this global distribution of impact ejecta. The immediate effects of the impact near the Yucatan were catastrophic beyond any ordinary scale of disaster. The seismic waves generated by the impact, which would have registered as an earthquake of a magnitude far beyond any in recorded human history, propagated outward from the impact site through the Earth's crust, generating massive ground motion that would have been felt around the entire planet. In the shallow seas of the Gulf of Mexico and the surrounding ocean, the impact generated tsunamis of extraordinary scale, waves that would have been kilometers in height as they moved outward from the impact site and would have traveled across the ocean basins at enormous speeds, devastating coastal environments wherever they made landfall. But these immediate, locally catastrophic effects were, in some sense, just the opening act of a much longer, much more globally devastating sequence of events. The true mechanism of the mass extinction was not the impact itself. It was what the impact set in motion, the chain of interconnected environmental disasters that followed it over the subsequent weeks, months, years, and decades, disasters that cumulatively destroyed the ecological foundation on which the entire diversity of late Cretaceous life depended. This chain of consequences is where the story of the end Cretaceous extinction becomes most scientifically interesting and most ecologically instructive, because it was not a single blow that ended the age of dinosaurs. It was a cascade, a series of linked environmental catastrophes, each one building on and exacerbating the others, creating conditions so extreme and so persistent that the recovery mechanisms that had served the Earth's ecosystem so well in previous crises were simply overwhelmed. The chain began in the atmosphere. The impact sent an enormous plume of vaporized rock and dust into the stratosphere, where it was distributed globally by high-altitude winds within hours to days of the impact. This material blocked sunlight, not completely and not uniformly, but enough to reduce the amount of solar energy reaching the Earth's surface by a significant fraction. And this reduction in sunlight had immediate and devastating consequences for the photosynthetic organisms, the plants and algae, on which all other life depended. Photosynthesis is the process by which plants convert sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water into the sugars that fuel their metabolism and the metabolism of everything that eats them. Reduce the available sunlight and you reduce the rate of photosynthesis. Reduce it enough and photosynthetic organisms begin to die. And when the plants die, everything that depends on the plants, directly or indirectly, is threatened. The herbivores lose their food source. The predators lose their prey. The decomposers lose the organic matter they break down. The entire food web, from its base to its apex, is destabilized by the removal of the energetic foundation that holds it together. But the atmospheric effects of the impact were more complex than a simple dust cloud reducing sunlight. The impact site contained enormous quantities of sulfur-rich rocks, the evaporites that form the geology of the Yucatan region, and the vaporization of these rocks released sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere in quantities sufficient to produce a global acidic haze. Sulfur dioxide combines with water vapor in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid droplets, which are highly reflective of sunlight. This additional reflective layer compounded the sunlight-reducing effect of the dust and soot, prolonging the period of reduced solar input and adding the element of acid rain to the already severe environmental stress. At the same time, the impact released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, both from the vaporization of the carbonate-rich limestones of the impact site and from the wildfires that the impact triggered across much of the planet. Carbon dioxide, of course, is a greenhouse gas, which means that its presence in the atmosphere traps outgoing heat radiation from the Earth's surface. So the impact set up a paradoxical situation, an initial period of global cooling caused by the blocking of incoming solar radiation, followed eventually by a period of warming caused by the elevated carbon dioxide concentrations. This sequence of extreme cold followed by extreme warmth, superimposed on ecosystems that were already devastated by the initial impacts and by the period of darkness, created a sustained period of environmental instability that further stressed surviving populations. The wildfires deserve particular attention because the evidence for them in the geological record is both striking and deeply informative about the scale of the environmental disruption. In boundary sections around the world, the iridium-rich clay layer is often associated with elevated concentrations of carbon in the form of soot and charcoal particles that are the direct physical record of massive burning. The source of this burning was the re-entry of the ballistic ejecta from the impact, the fragments of molten and solid rock that had been thrown on high arcing trajectories and re-entered the atmosphere over the hours following the impact. As these particles re-entered, they generated frictional heat, and collectively this process heated the upper atmosphere to temperatures that could ignite vegetation across vast areas of the continent closest to the impact. The scale of the burning that occurred in the aftermath of the Chicxulub impact is a subject of ongoing scientific investigation and some debate, with estimates of the geographic extent and the total amount of material burned varying between different studies. But the evidence for significant, widespread burning in the immediate aftermath of the impact is clear from the geological record, and the ecological consequences of burning across large areas of the late Cretaceous landscape would have been profound. Not only would the fires have directly destroyed vegetation and killed the animals that could not escape them, but the soot generated by those fires would have added to the atmospheric particulate load, further reducing the transmission of sunlight to the surface and exacerbating the already severe reduction in photosynthetic activity. The oceans were not spared the consequences of the impact. The massive quantities of sulfur dioxide released into the atmosphere, combined with other acidic gases produced by the vaporization of the target rocks and the combustion of organic material, produced rain of significantly elevated acidity. Acid rain falling into the ocean increases the acidity of surface waters, a process that is particularly damaging to organisms that build their shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate, which is soluble under acidic conditions. Ammonites, the coiled cephalopods that had been among the most diverse and abundant marine invertebrates of the Cretaceous oceans, were particularly vulnerable to this ocean acidification, and they went extinct entirely at the end of the Cretaceous. Many other groups of marine invertebrates were similarly affected, and the photosynthetic marine algae that formed the base of the marine food web were, like their terrestrial counterparts, devastated by the reduction in sunlight. The marine extinctions at the end of the Cretaceous were, if anything, even more dramatic than the terrestrial extinctions in terms of their ecological scope. The diversity of marine life declined catastrophically, with groups that had been dominant elements of Cretaceous marine ecosystems disappearing entirely or being reduced to tiny remnant populations. The mosasaurs, those large marine predators of the western interior seaway, disappeared completely. The plesiosaurs, already diminished by competition with the mosasaurs over the course of the Cretaceous, vanished. The ammonites, one of the most spectacularly diverse and evolutionarily successful groups of marine invertebrates in Earth's history, a group whose fossil record spans hundreds of millions of years before the Cretaceous, ended. They left no descendants, but the survivors of the marine extinction are equally informative. The sharks survived as they have survived several previous mass extinction events, their generalist predatory ecology and their physiological resilience making them capable of weathering the disruption of the marine food web. The bony fish survived, though with significantly reduced diversity. The sea turtles survived. And in the longer term, the marine ecosystems rebuilt themselves, driven by the rapid recovery of the photosynthetic plankton once the period of darkness ended and sunlight was again available to the surface waters. On land, the pattern of survival and extinction reflects the specific physiological and ecological vulnerabilities and resiliences of different groups. The non-avian dinosaurs, all of them, from the enormous Tyrannosaurus to the smallest known theropods, disappeared completely. Every last species, every last individual of the approximately 700 known species of non-avian dinosaurs ceased to exist within what the geological record suggests was a geologically very short period of time after the impact. The pterosaurs, already somewhat diminished in diversity by the late Cretaceous, also disappeared entirely. The crocodilians survived, the turtles survived, the lizards and snakes, though reduced in diversity, survived. The birds, the avian dinosaurs, survived, though with significant losses, and then in the aftermath of the extinction, radiated explosively into the ecological roles left vacant by the disappearance of their non-avian dinosaurian relatives. The mammals survived and then radiated even more dramatically, expanding from the small, ecologically marginal creatures of the Cretaceous into the full range of ecological roles that we associate with the mammalian fauna of the modern world. The pattern of these survivals and extinctions is not random. It reflects the specific vulnerabilities created by the impact and its consequences. Animals that could survive on reduced food resources, that could tolerate the severely disrupted and diminished ecosystems of the immediate post-impact world, that were small enough to find adequate nutrition even in a drastically impoverished environment, that were physiologically resilient to the extreme temperature fluctuations of the impact aftermath, that were able to reproduce quickly enough to sustain their populations through a period of high mortality. These were the organisms that survived. The large, specialized, high-energy animals of the late Cretaceous, the animals that the ecosystem had spent millions of years optimizing for specific roles in a specific environment, were devastated precisely because their optimization for the pre-impact world made them unable to cope with the profoundly different post-impact world. Let us now examine more carefully the specific sequence of events that followed the impact, the chain of environmental disasters that cumulatively produced the mass extinction. The sequence has been reconstructed by combining the physical and chemical evidence from boundary rock sections around the world with climate modeling, with studies of modern analog events, and with a detailed understanding of the biology and ecology of the organisms involved. In the first hours after the impact, while the enormous explosion was still shaking the planet, and the shock wave was propagating outward through the Earth's interior, the immediate vicinity of the impact site was being subjected to devastation on a scale that surpassed any natural disaster in the ordinary sense. The seismic energy released by the impact generated ground motion that would have been felt around the entire planet, shaking and destabilizing slopes, triggering landslides, and causing widespread structural damage to anything on the surface. The magnitude of the seismic event generated by the Chicxulub impact has been estimated at somewhere in the range of magnitude 11 to 12 on the Richter scale, an energy release so far beyond anything in the human experience of earthquakes that the comparison almost loses meaning. In the oceans adjacent to the impact site, the tsunami generation began almost immediately. The impact into the shallow waters of what was then the Proto-Gulf of Mexico generated a series of enormous waves that traveled outward from the impact site at the speed of deep water waves, hundreds of kilometers per hour, carrying their devastating energy across the ocean basins. When these waves reached shallow coastal areas and the continental margins, they grew in height, the energy of the deep water wave being concentrated as the water became shallower, until the waves that broke on the continental margins of the surrounding land areas were of extraordinary height and destructive power. The sedimentary record of these tsunamis is preserved in remarkable detail in several geological sections around the Gulf of Mexico region. Layers of chaotic, jumbled sediment containing material from deep water and shallow water mixed together, with evidence of the high energy deposition that characterizes tsunami washover events, are intercalated with the boundary clay layer in sections from Texas, from Mexico, from Cuba, and from elsewhere around the Gulf of Mexico. In some of these sections, the evidence of the tsunami is so clear and so precisely located relative to the iridium-rich boundary clay that the sequence of events, first the impact, then the tsunami, then the fallout of atmospheric ejecta, can be read directly from the rock. The tsunamis would have devastated the coastal ecosystems of the late Cretaceous. The low-lying coastal plains, which were among the most productive and ecologically diverse environments of the Cretaceous landscape, would have been inundated by walls of water of extraordinary power, stripping vegetation, killing animals, and redistributing enormous quantities of sediment in ways that would have taken years to decades to recover from even under normal conditions. Under the abnormal conditions of the post-impact world, of course, recovery from the tsunami was only one of many simultaneous challenges that the surviving organisms would have had to face. The fires came next, or perhaps simultaneously with the tsunamis and the initial seismic effects, as the ballistic ejecta began to re-enter the atmosphere. The rain of hot debris, heated by atmospheric friction to temperatures capable of igniting dry vegetation, began within hours of the impact and continued for a period that has been estimated at somewhere in the range of hours to perhaps a day or two. During this time, the amount of thermal radiation reaching the surface from the ray entering ejecta may have been significant enough to raise surface temperatures above the ignition point of dry vegetation across large areas of the continent, triggering continent-scale fires that burned everything flammable. The ecological consequences of these fires were profound and layered. Most immediately, the fires consumed enormous quantities of vegetation, destroying the plant communities on which the herbivores depended. Animals that could not outrun the fires, which in a landscape engulfed in flames on continental scales would have been most of the large herbivores, died in the flames. Animals that could escape to rivers or lakes or burrows might have survived the immediate thermal event, only to emerge into a landscape stripped of vegetation and blanketed in ash. The soot generated by these fires was, as mentioned earlier, an additional source of atmospheric particulate matter that reduced the transmission of sunlight to the surface. But the fires had another consequence that is worth noting. They converted an enormous amount of organic carbon, the carbon stored in living and dead vegetation, into atmospheric carbon dioxide and particulate carbon. This conversion of stored carbon to atmospheric carbon dioxide would contribute to the eventual warming that followed the initial cooling, while the particulate carbon contributed to the immediate darkening of the skies. And then came the darkness. This is perhaps the most ecologically devastating single consequence of the Chicxulub impact, the extended period of reduced sunlight that followed the injection of enormous quantities of dust, soot, and sulfate aerosols into the upper atmosphere. The modeling of this period of darkness, using climate models that incorporate what is known about the quantity and composition of the material injected into the atmosphere, suggests that the reduction in sunlight reaching the Earth's surface may have been dramatic enough to essentially halt photosynthesis globally for a period of months to potentially more than a year. Think about what that means. For months, perhaps for more than a year, the primary energy input into virtually every terrestrial and marine ecosystem on Earth was essentially shut off. Plants cannot grow without light. Algae cannot photosynthesize without light. The entire energetic foundation of the biosphere, the conversion of solar energy into chemical energy by photosynthetic organisms, was interrupted. And without that energy input, every organism in every food chain on the planet was facing the same fundamental problem. The food was running out, and it was running out everywhere at the same time. This is the mechanism that explains the selectivity of the end Cretaceous extinction with more precision than any other single factor. The question of which organisms survived and which perished is, in large part, the question of which organisms could survive for months to years in a world where photosynthesis had effectively ceased. Large animals, which required large amounts of food, and had no way to reduce their energy requirements to match the drastically reduced availability of food in their environment, were devastated. Small animals which could survive on reduced food inputs and which could exploit whatever food sources remained available in the disrupted landscape had at least the possibility of making it through. The food sources that remained available in the immediate aftermath of the impact were primarily the enormous quantities of dead organic matter that the catastrophe had produced. Dead leaves, dead wood, dead animal carcasses, seeds and spores dormant in the soil, these were the resources that the survivors of the immediate catastrophe had to sustain themselves on. Organisms that could exploit these resources, detritivores, scavengers, seed eaters, had an advantage over organisms that depended on living plant material or on the animals that fed on living plant material. This is why many of the surviving groups of the end Cretaceous extinction share the characteristic of being ecological generalists capable of exploiting a wide range of food sources, including detritus and dead organic matter. The ferns deserve special mention in this context because their response to the end Cretaceous catastrophe is one of the most clearly documented in the fossil record and one of the most ecologically informative. Ferns are vascular plants that reproduce by spores rather than seeds, and they are among the most resilient of all vascular plants in their ability to recolonize disturbed environments. Their spores are hardy, capable of surviving extended periods of dormancy in the soil, and when conditions become favorable for growth, even marginally favorable, fern spores germinate rapidly and the plants establish themselves quickly. This characteristic makes ferns classic pioneer species, the first plants to colonize bare ground after a disturbance. In the pollen and spore records preserved in rocks from the earliest Paleogene, the period immediately after the end of the Cretaceous, the signature of the catastrophe is unmistakable. The diverse assemblage of pollen from the many different plant types that characterized the late Cretaceous landscape disappears abruptly at the boundary layer, replaced by an almost monospecific spike in fern spores. This fern spike, as it is known in the palynological literature, is a global phenomenon found in boundary sections around the world, and it records the response of the plant community to the devastation of the impact aftermath. The diverse, multi-species plant community of the late Cretaceous was replaced, essentially overnight in geological terms, by a pioneer community dominated by ferns, the ecological equivalent of weeds colonizing bare ground after a catastrophic disturbance. This fern spike is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for the abruptness and the global extent of the end Cretaceous environmental catastrophe. It is not the gradual transition that would be expected if the extinction had been caused by a slow environmental change. It is a sudden, complete replacement of a diverse plant community by a single type of pioneer plant, followed over the subsequent centuries and millennia by the gradual recovery of plant diversity as different species returned to and recolonized the devastated landscape. The sequence of recovery preserved in the pollen record mirrors the sequence of ecological succession that we observe in modern ecosystems after major disturbances, from pioneer communities dominated by fast-reproducing generalists to more complex, diverse communities as conditions stabilize and more specialized species return. The temperature record from the boundary interval tells a story that is consistent with the sequence of events we have been describing. Chemical proxies for ancient temperature, preserved in the chemistry of deep-sea sediments and carbonate rocks from the boundary interval, show a complex pattern. In the immediate aftermath of the impact, there is evidence for a period of cooling, consistent with the predicted reduction in solar input caused by the atmospheric particulate loading. But this cooling was followed over a longer timescale of years to decades by a period of warming, consistent with the elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations that resulted from the burning and from the degassing of the carbonate target rocks. The overall pattern is one of extreme instability, of temperature swings far outside the range that the late Cretaceous ecosystems had been adapted to, imposed on organisms that were already severely stressed by the loss of their food supplies. The combination of these multiple stressors, the direct physical destruction of the impact and the tsunami and the fires, the extended period of darkness that halted photosynthesis, the extreme temperature instability, the ocean acidification, the destruction of food webs at every level from the base up, created a situation in which survival was determined not by the quality of an organism's adaptation to the pre-impact world, but by its ability to survive the specific conditions of the post-impact world. And the post-impact world was, in almost every way, the opposite of what the non-avian dinosaurs had been adapted to. It was cold, dark, resource-poor, unstable, and deeply hostile to large, specialized, high-energy organisms. The large non-avian dinosaurs were, from this perspective, almost perfectly mal-adapted to the post-impact world. Their size, which had been an asset in the competitive environment of the late Cretaceous, demanding large territories, requiring large food resources, but allowing them to dominate their ecological roles and to suppress competition from smaller animals, became a fatal liability in a world where food had become catastrophically scarce. Their specialization, which had allowed them to exploit specific food resources with extraordinary efficiency in the stable late Cretaceous environment, became equally fatal in a world where their specific food resources had disappeared or been drastically reduced. And their slow reproductive rates, with long generation times and small numbers of offspring per breeding event compared to the small mammals and birds that would eventually replace them, meant that their populations could not recover quickly enough from the high mortality of the post-impact period to maintain themselves above the minimum viable population sizes necessary for persistence. We can reconstruct, at least conceptually, what the late Cretaceous landscape looked like in the weeks and months after the impact. It was a landscape in which the familiar, functioning ecosystem had been replaced by something almost unrecognizable. The forests that had covered the coastal plain were burned or stripped by the tsunami, or simply dying as the light failed and the temperatures fluctuated wildly. The rivers, their banks no longer stabilized by plant roots, were cutting new courses through the bare, eroded landscape, transporting enormous quantities of silt and debris. The air, thick with dust and soot, filtered what little light reached the surface into a dim, reddish twilight. And moving through this devastated landscape were the survivors, the small, the generalist, the ecologically flexible organisms that had somehow made it through the immediate catastrophe, and were now faced with the challenge of finding enough to eat in a world that had been stripped of most of its food resources. Among those survivors, the small mammals would have been searching for food in the debris-covered landscape, eating dead organic matter, seeds, insects, and anything else they could find. The birds would have been doing the same. The small lizards and snakes would have been sheltering in burrows and crevices, their ectothermic physiology actually an advantage in the resource-poor environment, since they could reduce their metabolic activity in ways that warm-blooded animals cannot, and thus survive for longer on minimal food. The crocodilians, lurking in whatever rivers and lakes remained, were in a somewhat better position than the terrestrial animals, because aquatic ecosystems, nourished by the dead organic matter washing into them from the devastated terrestrial landscape, retained more food resources than the bare, burned land. And somewhere in that devastated landscape, the last non-avian dinosaurs were dying. Not all at once, perhaps not even most of them in the immediate weeks and months after the impact. But inexorably, irreversibly, as their food supplies failed and their populations declined, as each breeding season produced fewer offspring and fewer of those offspring survived, as the population numbers fell below the thresholds at which viable breeding populations could be maintained. The end was not necessarily instantaneous for every population, in every location. But it was inevitable once the cascade of environmental disruption had set in motion the collapse of the food webs on which they depended. By the time the skies began to clear, by the time the atmospheric particulate loading had settled enough to allow photosynthesis to resume, and the pioneer plant communities of ferns and other resilient species to begin their recolonization of the bare landscape, the non-avian dinosaurs were gone. Gone from a planet they had dominated for 160 million years. Gone from an ecological stage they had occupied so thoroughly that the thought of it empty must, for any organism capable of thought, have been incomprehensible. Gone, leaving behind only their bones, their footprints, and the fossil record of their extraordinary lives, to be discovered, studied, and marveled at by the small, warm-blooded, large-brained descendants of the tiny mammals that had survived the catastrophe by hiding in the darkness and eating whatever scraps remained. The fossil record does not end with the Chicxulub impact, of course. The story continues, and it continues in ways that are both scientifically fascinating and deeply informative about the nature of ecological recovery after catastrophic disruption. But the story of the recovery belongs to the second part of our exploration. What we have established in this first part of our investigation is the foundation on which that story rests. The magnificence of the world that was lost, the nature and scale of the catastrophe that destroyed it, and the initial stages of the process by which life on Earth began the long, slow, extraordinary work of rebuilding from the ruins. Let us take a moment before we conclude this first section of our exploration to reflect on what we have learned about the nature of ecosystems and the nature of catastrophe. The late Cretaceous world was not a primitive or simple place. It was a world of extraordinary biological sophistication, the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolution building on itself, each generation of organisms modifying the environment in which the next generation would evolve. The accumulated innovations of countless evolutionary experiments creating an ecological framework of remarkable complexity and resilience. The predator-prey relationships, the mutualistic relationships between plants and their pollinators, the decomposer communities that cycled nutrients through the system, the intricate web of interactions that connected every organism to every other organism through chains and cycles of energy and matter, all of this was the product of an evolutionary process so long and so cumulative that it truly strains the human capacity for comprehension. And all of it was vulnerable. Vulnerable not because it was poorly designed or because it was already failing, but because it was exquisitely adapted to a specific set of conditions, and those conditions were about to change so rapidly and so completely that adaptation was impossible. The evolutionary process, which is magnificently capable of adjusting organisms to changing conditions over thousands or millions of years, is completely helpless in the face of change that happens on a timescale of months or years. Evolution has no emergency response mechanism, no way to rapidly reprogram organisms for radically different conditions when the change happens faster than the generation time of the organisms involved. What evolution can do after the catastrophe has passed and the survivors are facing the new world is begin the slow process of adaptation all over again, building new complexity on the foundation of what survived. And that process of rebuilding, of the gradual recomplexification of life on Earth in the aftermath of the end Cretaceous catastrophe, is the other half of our story. It is a story of recovery, of resilience, of the remarkable capacity of life to reassert itself even in the most severely disrupted environments. It is a story that begins in the bleak, resource-poor aftermath of the impact winter and ends, tens of millions of years later, in the rich, diverse world we inhabit today, a world that is itself the product of the recovery from the greatest catastrophe in the history of complex life on land. But before we can fully understand the recovery, we need to understand the full extent of what was lost. And that full extent can only be appreciated by examining the fossil record with the kind of careful, systematic attention that the paleontologists who have devoted their careers to understanding the end Cretaceous extinction have brought to it. They have found in rock layers from around the world, from Montana and the Dakotas in the American West to China, from Spain to New Zealand, from India to Antarctica, a consistent pattern of change at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary that tells the same story everywhere it is found. Below the boundary, the full diversity of late Cretaceous life. The dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, the ammonites, the rudists, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, the diverse flowering plant communities of the late Cretaceous landscape. Above the boundary, after the thin, chemically anomalous clay layer, a dramatically impoverished world. A world in which the dominant large animals are gone, in which the plant communities have been reset to pioneer species, in which the ecological roles that the great dinosaurs had filled for 160 million years stand empty, waiting to be filled by the opportunistic generalists and their descendants. This pattern, this precise, globally consistent transition from a world of extraordinary biological richness to a world of greatly reduced diversity, all concentrated at a single, thin stratigraphic horizon that carries the chemical and physical signature of a massive extraterrestrial impact, is the core evidence for the story we are telling. It is evidence that has been accumulated over decades of scientific investigation by hundreds of researchers working independently in different parts of the world, using different analytical techniques and approaching the problem from different disciplinary perspectives. And it all converges on the same conclusion. The age of dinosaurs ended not with a gradual decline, but with a catastrophic, impact-driven collapse that reset the trajectory of life on Earth in ways that continue to shape the world we live in today. There is one more aspect of the pre-impact world that deserves attention before we conclude this first section, and that is the question of what precisely made the late Cretaceous ecosystem so vulnerable to the specific kind of catastrophe that destroyed it. We have already touched on the vulnerability of large, specialized animals to sudden food resource loss, but the vulnerability was not only biological. It was also structural, in the sense that the architecture of the late Cretaceous food web, with its dependence on a diverse plant community at the base and its complex, interconnected web of herbivore and predator relationships built on top of that plant community, was specifically vulnerable to exactly the kind of disruption that the impact produced. A food web is only as stable as its base. If the base, the photosynthetic organisms that convert solar energy into biological energy, is destroyed or severely compromised, the entire structure built on top of it collapses. This is the fundamental ecological principle that the Chicxulub impact exploited, not purposefully of course, but effectively. By injecting enough material into the atmosphere to significantly reduce global photosynthesis for an extended period, the impact attacked the food web at its most fundamental level, the level below which there is no further redundancy, no alternative pathway, no way to substitute a different energy source for the solar energy that drives photosynthesis. In a more heterogeneous world, a world with more varied energy sources, with more redundancy in the food web base, the impact might have been less devastatingly complete in its effects. But the late Cretaceous world was, for all its diversity and complexity, fundamentally dependent on photosynthesis as its primary energy source. Remove photosynthesis, even temporarily, and the food web loses its energetic foundation. And without that foundation, the remarkable complexity of the food web that had been built upon it has no way to sustain itself. This vulnerability is not a unique feature of the late Cretaceous ecosystem. It is a fundamental characteristic of virtually every ecosystem on Earth, past and present. The dependence of essentially all terrestrial and most marine food webs on photosynthesis as the primary energy input means that any catastrophe capable of severely disrupting global photosynthesis for an extended period would be potentially devastating to the biosphere as a whole. The end Cretaceous impact was, in this sense, not just a catastrophe for the dinosaurs. It was a catastrophe for the concept of ecological complexity itself, a demonstration of the ultimate fragility that lies beneath even the most robust and resilient of ecosystems. The story of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is, at its deepest level, a story about the relationship between stability and catastrophe, about the limits of resilience, about the difference between the challenges that ecosystems can absorb and adapt to, and the challenges that overwhelm even the most robust ecological systems. It is a story that has profound implications for our understanding of how life on Earth works, how it has been shaped by its history, and how the extraordinary diversity of the modern biosphere came to be what it is. In this first part of our exploration, we have covered the world that existed before the catastrophe, the ecological richness and complexity of the late Cretaceous, the nature and behavior of the great dinosaurs that dominated it, the evidence for the asteroid impact that ended it, the initial chain of consequences that unfolded from that impact, and the fundamental ecological reasons why the catastrophe was so devastating to so many of the organisms that had flourished in the pre-impact world. We have established the scale of what was lost and the mechanism by which it was lost. In the second part of our exploration, we will follow the story forward in time, into the bleak aftermath of the catastrophe, and through the long, remarkable process of ecological and evolutionary recovery that followed it. We will trace the emergence of new ecological communities from the ruins of the old, the rapid diversification of the mammals and birds that inherited the ecological stage vacated by the non-avian dinosaurs, and the gradual rebuilding of the complex, diverse world that the catastrophe had destroyed. And we will reflect on what this story tells us about the nature of life on Earth, about the relationship between extinction and innovation, about the ways in which the greatest catastrophes in the history of the biosphere have also been, in their long-term consequences, the greatest drivers of the biological diversification that has produced the world we know today. The dinosaurs are gone, but their story is not finished. Because the story of the dinosaurs is also the story of the world that came after them, the world that their disappearance made possible. And that world, for all its differences from the Cretaceous world that preceded it, carries within it the echoes of what was lost, the ghosts of the great creatures that once walked this planet, preserved not only in the rocks that hold their bones but in the evolutionary heritage of the birds that are their surviving descendants, and in the ecological roles that their successors have filled, imperfectly and differently, in the 66 million years since the sky fell on the age of dinosaurs. When the dust begins to settle, literally and figuratively, after a catastrophe of the magnitude we explored in the first part of our journey, what remains is not simply an empty stage waiting for new actors to arrive. What remains is something far more complex, far more nuanced, and far more scientifically interesting than a simple vacancy. What remains is a world profoundly altered in its physical character, its chemical composition, its temperature regime, and its ecological structure. A world in which the rules of survival have been rewritten so completely that the organisms best equipped to thrive in it bear little resemblance to the magnificent creatures that dominated the landscape before the catastrophe struck. What remains, in short, is the beginning of a new story. And that new story, the story of recovery, of rebuilding, of the slow and extraordinary reassertion of biological complexity in the aftermath of the greatest catastrophe in the history of complex life on land, is in many ways as remarkable as the story of the world that was lost. We left our story at the moment when the non-avian dinosaurs had disappeared, when the skies above a devastated, resource-stripped landscape were beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to clear, when the pioneer plant communities were beginning their tentative recolonization of the bare, ash-covered ground. We left it at the moment when the survivors, the small and the generalist and the ecologically flexible, were picking their way through the wreckage of an ecosystem that had taken 160 million years to build and had been destroyed in a geological instant. Now we follow those survivors forward in time, through the first difficult years and decades and centuries of the post-impact world, and then through the longer arc of recovery that stretched across millions of years, transforming a world of ruins into a world of renewed and different, but no less extraordinary, biological richness. The immediate post-impact world, the world of the first months and years after the Chicxulub event, was as hostile an environment as the Earth has experienced in the history of complex multicellular life. The combination of reduced sunlight, extreme temperature fluctuations, acid rain, disrupted hydrological cycles, and the near-total collapse of food webs created conditions that would have been, for any organism attempting to persist through them, a test of survival at the most fundamental biological level. The question was not which organisms were best adapted to the new conditions. The question was which organisms could simply stay alive long enough for conditions to improve sufficiently for meaningful biological activity to resume. The answer to that question, as revealed by the fossil record of the earliest Paleogene, tells us something profound about the nature of resilience in biological systems. The organisms that survived were not the most complex, the most specialized, or the most ecologically sophisticated. They were, with a few notable exceptions, the most fundamentally basic in their biological requirements. They were organisms that could tolerate a wide range of temperatures, organisms that could eat a wide range of food types, organisms that could reduce their metabolic activity in times of extreme resource scarcity, organisms that could survive as dormant seeds or spores or eggs when conditions were too severe for active life. Organisms that could reproduce quickly enough to replace the individuals lost to the brutal post-impact conditions before the population fell below the minimum viable size. In the terrestrial realm, the immediate survivors were concentrated among several broad categories. The small mammals, as we noted in our first section, had the physiological and ecological characteristics that would allow them to scrape through the post-impact period on minimal resources. Their small body size meant their absolute food requirements were low. Their teeth and digestive systems were generalist enough to exploit a wide range of food types, from seeds and roots to insects and small vertebrates to dead organic matter. And their reproductive rates were high enough that even significant mortality events could be absorbed without driving populations to extinction, as long as some individuals survived to breed and the food supply remained sufficient to sustain even a minimal level of reproduction. The birds, the avian dinosaurs, similarly benefited from several biological characteristics that made them better suited to the post-impact world than their non-avian dinosaurian relatives. Their small body size, at least among the groups that survived, was an advantage for the same reasons that small body size was an advantage in the mammals. Their ability to fly gave them a capacity for rapid movement across the landscape in search of food resources that terrestrial animals lacked, allowing them to exploit patchy, unevenly distributed resources more effectively. And many of the bird lineages that survived the extinction had dietary habits that made them less dependent on living plant material than the large herbivorous dinosaurs had been. Seed-eating birds, for example, could exploit the enormous store of dormant seeds in the post-impact soil, a resource that would have been unavailable to animals without the specialized morphology to extract and process seeds. The insects survived, though not without significant losses of diversity. The insects that made it through the post-impact period were characteristically those with the most generalist ecological habits, the most flexible dietary requirements, and the most resilient life cycle stages. Many insect species have dormant stages, eggs, or pupae that can survive extended periods of adverse conditions, and it was likely these dormant stages that carried many insect lineages through the worst of the post-impact period. The recovery of insect diversity in the aftermath of the extinction was relatively rapid, partly because insects have such short generation times and such high reproductive rates that evolutionary diversification can occur on timescales that are fast even by evolutionary standards. The plants present a particularly fascinating and well-documented case of post-impact survival and recovery. The dramatic fern spike that we described in our first section, the sudden dominance of fern spores in the pollen record at and immediately above the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, is the clearest botanical signature of the post-impact ecological reset. But the ferns were not the only survivors, and the pattern of plant survival tells us something important about the mechanisms that allow plant communities to persist through catastrophic disturbance. Seeds are remarkable structures from the perspective of survival biology. They are physiologically dormant packages of genetic information and stored energy, capable of remaining viable in the soil for extended periods, sometimes decades or even longer, while conditions are unsuitable for germination and growth. In the post-impact landscape, the seeds stored in the soil, seeds from the diverse plant community of the late Cretaceous, formed a biological reservoir, a bank of potential plant diversity waiting for conditions to improve enough for germination to become possible. As the atmospheric clearing progressed and light levels at the surface began to recover, these dormant seeds began to germinate, and the plant community began its slow process of reconstruction from this underground reserve. But not all plant species were equally represented in this seed bank. Species that produced large quantities of small, hardy seeds were better represented than species that produced fewer, larger seeds or that reproduced primarily by other means. Species whose seeds were adapted for dispersal by wind or by small animals were better represented than those that depended on large animals, many of which had disappeared, for seed dispersal. And species whose seeds could remain viable for longer periods in adverse soil conditions were better represented than those with shorter-lived seeds. These characteristics of the survivors, characteristics that had nothing to do with the overall ecological sophistication or competitive ability of the plant species in the pre-impact world, determined which plant species had a future in the post-impact world. The underground root systems and rhizomes of many plant species also played an important role in post-impact survival. Plants with extensive underground storage systems could survive the loss of their above-ground parts to fire or frost and regenerate from below ground when conditions allowed. Ferns, of course, with their underground rhizomes, were particularly well equipped for exactly this kind of vegetative regeneration, which is why the fern spike that dominates the earliest post-impact plant record reflects not just germination from spores, but also the rapid regeneration of existing fern plants from underground rhizomes that survived the catastrophe. The pattern of recovery that emerges from the plant fossil record over the first thousands and tens of thousands of years after the impact is one of gradual ecological succession. The pioneer community dominated by ferns and a few other resilient species was replaced, over time, by a more diverse community as different plant species reestablished themselves from their dormant stages or recolonized the disturbed landscape from refugia where they had survived in greater diversity. This succession from pioneer community to more complex, diverse community mirrors the patterns of ecological succession that we observe in modern ecosystems after major disturbances, from the first colonizers of bare rock or burn scars to the eventual development of mature forest, a process driven by the same fundamental ecological dynamics in the post-impact world as in any modern disturbed landscape. The rate of this recovery varied by location. In areas closest to the impact site, where the initial destruction had been most complete and where the ongoing post-impact environmental stresses were most severe, recovery was slowest. In areas farther from the impact, where some pockets of habitat might have escaped the worst of the immediate destruction, the surviving biological community was richer and recovery was faster. In aquatic environments, which retained more biological complexity through the post-impact period than the most severely affected terrestrial environments, recovery began earlier and proceeded more quickly, with aquatic food webs reconstructing themselves from surviving populations of organisms that had been less severely impacted by the darkness and the temperature extremes. These geographic patterns of recovery are not simply interesting details. They have important implications for understanding the sources of the biological diversity that eventually repopulated the post-impact world. The refugia, the pockets of habitat where biological communities survived the catastrophe in greater diversity than the surrounding landscape, were the seed sources from which the recovery radiated. The organisms that survived in these refugia and that dispersed from them as conditions improved were the founders of the new ecological communities that gradually replaced the impoverished pioneer communities of the immediate post-impact world. In the oceans, the pattern of recovery has been particularly well studied, partly because the marine fossil record is more continuous and more complete than the terrestrial record, and partly because the marine geochemical record provides unusually detailed information about the environmental conditions in which the recovery took place. The immediate post-impact ocean was, as we described in our first section, severely stressed by acidification, by reduced sunlight that compromised the photosynthetic plankton at the base of the marine food web, and by the collapse of the large predators whose food sources had been disrupted. But the recovery of the marine realm provides one of the most compelling illustrations of the remarkable capacity of life to rebuild complexity even after catastrophic disruption. The photosynthetic plankton, the microscopic algae and cyanobacteria that form the energetic foundation of marine food webs, were among the first organisms to begin recovering once the period of atmospheric darkness began to lift. Their tiny size and their reproductive rates, measured in hours rather than years, meant that surviving populations could expand rapidly as soon as light levels recovered enough to support photosynthesis. Within tens of thousands of years, the marine photosynthetic community was recovering, rebuilding the energetic foundation on which the rest of the marine food web depended. The recovery of marine animal communities followed the recovery of the photosynthetic base as food chains rebuilt themselves from the bottom up. But the process was not simply a restoration of what had existed before. The organisms that had survived the extinction were not a representative sample of the pre-impact marine fauna. They were a biased sample, biased toward the generalists, the opportunists, the organisms with the biological characteristics that allowed them to survive the post-impact conditions. And as these survivors began to diversify in the post-impact world, freed from the competitive pressure of the many groups that had disappeared, they diversified into ecological roles and along evolutionary trajectories that produced communities fundamentally different from those of the Cretaceous. The new marine communities that emerged in the early Paleogene were, initially, simpler than the Cretaceous communities they replaced. The apex marine predators, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, were gone, and their roles were not immediately filled. The great diversity of ammonites was gone, leaving their ecological roles to be taken over, gradually and imperfectly, by other groups of cephalopods and by the rapidly diversifying bony fish. The diverse communities of reef-building organisms that had been characteristic of Cretaceous tropical seas were devastated, and the recovery of reef ecosystems was one of the slowest aspects of the marine recovery, requiring millions of years for anything resembling pre-extinction reef complexity to re-emerge. But as the early Paleogene progressed, as the environmental conditions stabilized, and the recovering photosynthetic base supported an increasing richness of consumer organisms, the marine fauna began to diversify. Fish diversified into new ecological roles. Sharks, those survivors of multiple extinction events, continued their long evolutionary story. new groups of invertebrates expanded to fill the roles left vacant by the extinct Cretaceous groups. And the ocean, which had been so dramatically simplified by the extinction, began the long process of building new complexity on the foundation of what had survived. On land, the story of recovery was dominated, in the early stages, by the extraordinary adaptive radiation of the mammals. This radiation, the explosive diversification of mammalian lineages into the ecological roles vacated by the disappearance of the non-avian dinosaurs, is one of the most dramatic and well-documented events in the evolutionary history of life on Earth. In the Cretaceous, mammals had been confined to the small, nocturnal, ecologically marginal niches that the dominant dinosaurian fauna had left available to them. In the post-extinction world, those constraints were suddenly gone, and the mammals responded to their liberation with an evolutionary exuberance that, over the course of the early Paleogene, transformed them from a collection of small, mouse-like creatures into the diverse array of ecological forms that includes the ancestors of everything from whales to elephants to bats to humans. The rapidity of this mammalian radiation is, from a paleontological perspective, remarkable. Within just a few million years of the end Cretaceous extinction, the fossil record shows mammals occupying ecological roles that had previously been filled exclusively by dinosaurs and their relatives. Large herbivores, occupying the plant processing roles that had been the domain of the hadrosaurs and ceratopsians, appeared among the mammals within millions of years of the extinction. Large carnivores, occupying the apex predator roles that had been the province of Tyrannosaurus and its relatives, took somewhat longer to evolve in the mammals, partly because the evolution of large predators requires a pre-existing community of large prey to support them, and the development of large mammalian herbivore communities preceded the development of large mammalian carnivore communities. This sequence of ecological recovery, from the establishment of the plant community base to the development of herbivore communities feeding on that plant base, to the eventual development of predator communities feeding on those herbivores, mirrors the sequence that we can observe in any ecosystem recovering from severe disturbance. It is the ecological analog of the succession from pioneer plant community to mature forest, a process driven by the same fundamental ecological dynamics, the need for each trophic level to be established before the trophic level above it can develop, the dependence of each level of the food web on the productivity of the level below it. The earliest Paleogene mammals were not recognizable ancestors of their modern descendants. They were experimental forms, evolutionary explorers testing the possibilities of the newly available ecological space, many of them going extinct themselves as the post-impact world stabilized and competitive exclusion began to sort out which lineages could most efficiently exploit the available resources. But among them were the lineages that would give rise, over tens of millions of years of subsequent evolution, to every mammalian group alive today. The placental mammals, which give birth to relatively well-developed young after a long gestation period, diverged early in the Paleogene into the major lineages, the orders that characterize the modern mammalian fauna. The ungulates, the hoofed mammals, diverged into the ancestors of today's horses, rhinoceroses, tapirs, cattle, deer, pigs, camels, and many other groups. The carnivores, the order that includes today's cats, dogs, bears, seals, and their relatives, diverged from a common ancestor that was quite different from any of its modern descendants. The primates, the order that includes lemurs, monkeys, apes, and humans, appeared early in the Paleogene as small, arboreal, insect-eating creatures that bore no obvious resemblance to their eventual human descendants. The marsupial mammals, which give birth to very undeveloped young and complete their development in a pouch, also diversified in the aftermath of the extinction, though they were eventually outcompeted by the placentals in most parts of the world, surviving primarily in the isolated continent of Australia and in the Americas. And the egg-laying monotremes, represented today only by the platypus and the echidnas, were likely more diverse in the early Paleogene than they are today, though their fossil record is fragmentary. The story of this mammalian radiation is not simply a story of ecological replacement, of one group filling the roles vacated by another. It is a story of genuine evolutionary innovation, of new biological designs being explored and tested in the context of a world that was fundamentally different from the one in which the dinosaurs had evolved. The mammals that diversified in the Paleogene were not simply dinosaur substitutes. They were new kinds of organisms with new behavioral capabilities, new reproductive strategies, new metabolic designs, and new ecological relationships with the plant communities they exploited and with each other. One of the most significant differences between the new mammalian world and the old dinosaurian world was the nature of the plant-animal relationships. The flowering plants, which had been diversifying through the Cretaceous, and which survived the extinction in greater diversity than the non-flowering plant groups, continued their radiation in the Paleogene, and the relationships they formed with the diversifying mammalian fauna were different in important ways from the relationships that had characterized the Cretaceous ecosystem. The coevolution of flowering plants and their animal partners, including mammals as seed dispersers and pollinators, and eventually including the highly derived relationships between grasses and the grazing mammals that would transform the face of the planet in the later Cenozoic, was a new chapter in the evolutionary story of life on Earth, one that produced ecological relationships of extraordinary intimacy and mutual dependence. The birds, meanwhile, were undergoing their own remarkable radiation in the aftermath of the extinction. The avian survivors of the end Cretaceous catastrophe were not a diverse, ecologically complete sample of the bird fauna of the Cretaceous. They were, like the mammalian survivors, a biased sample of small, ecologically generalist forms that had somehow made it through the post-impact period. But from this limited foundation, the birds diversified with extraordinary speed and ecological ambition in the early Paleogene, expanding into virtually every available ecological role in the terrestrial and aquatic environments. Some of the early Paleogene birds were extraordinarily large, exploiting the temporary absence of large mammalian predators by evolving into apex predators themselves. These large, flightless predatory birds, known informally as terror birds, were formidable animals, with enormous hooked beaks capable of delivering devastating blows to prey, and long, powerful legs that gave them the speed to pursue swift-running prey across open landscapes. For a period in the early Paleogene, before the mammalian carnivores had evolved to the size and capability necessary to fill the apex predator role, the large flightless birds were the dominant terrestrial predators in parts of the world, a role that no bird occupies today. Other bird lineages diversified into the ecological roles that they continue to occupy in the modern world, and in many cases the diversification into these roles happened with surprising speed. Water birds, birds of prey, and the early members of several modern bird orders appear in the fossil record of the early Paleogene in forms that, while not identical to their modern representatives, are clearly recognizable as ancestral members of the groups that define the modern avian fauna. The remarkable diversity of modern birds, which with approximately 10,000 species constitutes the most diverse class of terrestrial vertebrates on the planet, is the direct product of this Paleogene radiation, itself made possible by the catastrophe that eliminated their non-avian dinosaurian relatives and opened the ecological space into which they diversified. The forests that began to recover in the aftermath of the extinction were not the forests of the Cretaceous. They were different in their composition, different in their structure, and different in their ecological relationships with the animals that inhabited them. The flowering plants, freed from the competitive pressure of the non-flowering plant groups that had been dominant in the Cretaceous, diversified explosively in the Paleogene, and the angiosperm-dominated forests that developed in the early Paleogene were richer in flowering plant diversity than anything that had existed in the Cretaceous. These forests were not simply a reconstruction of what had been lost. They were a new kind of forest, built on the template of the surviving plant lineages, but arranged in new ways, shaped by the new animal communities that were evolving alongside them. The relationship between the diversifying flowering plants and the diversifying mammals was one of the most important ecological dynamics of the early Paleogene. Fruit-bearing trees and shrubs co-evolved with the mammals that ate their fruits and dispersed their seeds, each lineage shaping the evolution of the other through their ongoing ecological interaction. The development of flowers attractive to insect pollinators continued to drive the co-evolution of plant and insect diversity. And the development of nutrient-rich seeds that could attract and reward mammalian seed dispersers created new patterns of plant dispersal and forest composition that would continue to evolve throughout the Cenozoic. The climate of the early Paleogene played an important role in shaping the pattern of ecological recovery. After the extreme instability of the immediate post-impact period, the climate gradually restabilized, but it did not restabilize at the same point it had been in the late Cretaceous. The massive quantities of carbon dioxide released by the impact, through the vaporization of carbonate rocks, the burning of vegetation, and the subsequent volcanic activity, had raised atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, and this elevated carbon dioxide contributed to a warming trend that characterized the early Paleogene. The world of the early Paleogene was warm, perhaps even warmer in some respects than the late Cretaceous, with tropical and subtropical conditions extending to relatively high latitudes. This warmth was conducive to the rapid development of diverse, productive terrestrial ecosystems. In the warm, wet conditions of the early Paleogene, forest communities could expand rapidly, and the high productivity of these forests could support increasingly diverse and abundant animal communities. The recovery of ecosystem complexity was therefore faster in the warm, productive low and mid-latitude regions than in the higher latitude regions, where cooler temperatures and greater seasonality imposed additional constraints on the recovery of biological diversity. But the early Paleogene was also a period of continued environmental instability, punctuated by episodes of more extreme warming or cooling that posed ongoing challenges to the recovering ecological communities. One of the most dramatic of these episodes occurred approximately 56 million years ago, about 10 million years after the end Cretaceous extinction, in an event known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. This event, caused by a massive release of carbon into the atmosphere from geological sources, produced a rapid warming of global temperatures by several degrees over a period of thousands of years, causing significant disruption to marine and terrestrial ecosystems and driving some groups of organisms to extinction while creating opportunities for others. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum is an important reminder that the story of ecological recovery from the end Cretaceous extinction was not a smooth, uninterrupted progression from simplicity to complexity. It was a story punctuated by additional challenges, by climate fluctuations and other environmental perturbations that tested the resilience of the recovering ecosystems and shaped the evolutionary trajectories of the diversifying lineages. The world of the early Cenozoic was not a static or simple world. It was a dynamic, changing world in which the recovering biological communities were continuously being tested and reshaped by ongoing environmental change. Despite these complications, the overall trajectory of the early Paleogene was toward increasing ecological complexity and diversity. By the time we reached the Eocene epoch, which began approximately 56 million years ago and ended about 34 million years ago, the terrestrial ecosystems of the world were already substantially more complex than they had been in the immediate aftermath of the extinction. diverse mammalian communities, including early representatives of many of the major modern orders, were established in warm, productive forests across the low and mid-latitude regions. The birds had diversified into most of the ecological roles that they continue to occupy today. The flowering plant communities were rich and diverse, supporting complex webs of herbivore, pollinator, and seed disperser interactions. But these Eocene ecosystems, for all their growing complexity, were still quite different from the Cretaceous ecosystems they had replaced. The large body sizes that had characterized the late Cretaceous megafauna were slow to re-emerge in the mammals. The early Paleogene mammals were predominantly small, and while some lineages were trending toward larger body sizes by the Eocene, the truly large mammals, animals comparable in size to the large dinosaurs of the Cretaceous, did not appear until the later stages of the Eocene and the subsequent Oligocene epoch. This delay in the evolution of large body size is ecologically significant. It reflects the time required for ecological communities to rebuild the complex, stable food webs that can support large animals. Large herbivores require productive, diverse plant communities that can sustain their high food requirements. Large carnivores require large herbivore communities that can sustain their equally high food requirements. The construction of food webs capable of supporting animals of large body size is therefore a slow, stepwise process, each trophic level requiring the prior development of the trophic level below it. The time required to rebuild the ecological architecture that supports large body sizes explains why the megafauna of the early Paleogene were predominantly small, and why the evolution of truly large mammals took millions of years after the extinction of the large dinosaurs. The Eocene world provides some of the most fascinating glimpses into the process of ecological recovery and evolutionary diversification that followed the end Cretaceous catastrophe. The fossil beds of the Eocene from various parts of the world, some of them extraordinarily rich and well-preserved, document a world in transition, a world in which the ecological roles and evolutionary directions of the modern fauna were being established, but in which many of the specific forms were quite different from their modern descendants. The early horses of the Eocene, for example, were small, multi-toed animals that lived in dense forests and browsed on soft vegetation, bearing little resemblance to the large, long-legged, single-toed grazers of the modern world. The early primates of the Eocene were small, arboreal insect eaters, with large eyes adapted for nocturnal or crepuscular activity and grasping hands and feet suited for life in the trees. The early members of the carnivore order were more generalist in their habits than most modern carnivores, with less specialized dentition and locomotion, capable of exploiting a wider range of food sources and ecological contexts than the highly derived modern carnivores that would eventually evolve from them. These early Paleogene mammals were not failures or primitive precursors of the real thing. They were fully functional organisms, well adapted to the ecological contexts in which they lived, the warm, diverse forests of the early Cenozoic. But they were also the raw material of future evolution, lineages that would continue to diversify and specialize as the environments of the Cenozoic continued to change, as the climate cooled and dried in the later Cenozoic, as new habitats opened up and new ecological opportunities presented themselves to organisms that had the evolutionary flexibility to exploit them. The cooling of the global climate that began in the late Eocene and accelerated through the Oligocene epoch was one of the most important environmental drivers of mammalian evolution in the Cenozoic. As global temperatures declined from the extreme warmth of the early Eocene, the tropical forests that had covered much of the world's land area began to retreat toward the equator, replaced at higher latitudes by more seasonal, temperate forests, and eventually by the open grasslands that are one of the most ecologically significant biomes on the modern Earth. This environmental change created new ecological opportunities and new evolutionary challenges that drove the diversification of several of the most important mammalian lineages. The development of grasslands in the later Cenozoic was a transformative event in the history of terrestrial ecosystems. Grasses, which had originated in the Cretaceous as a relatively minor component of plant communities, diversified explosively in the Oligocene and Miocene as the cooling, drying climate created the open, seasonally arid environments in which grasses are most competitive. The spread of grasslands across the interiors of the continents created enormous areas of open habitat that were fundamentally different in their ecological character from the forests that had preceded them, and the organisms that colonized these new habitats were faced with evolutionary challenges that drove rapid diversification. The ungulate mammals were among the primary beneficiaries of the grassland expansion. The horses, which in the Eocene had been small, multi-toed forest browsers, evolved through the Oligocene and Miocene in response to the changing conditions, developing the longer legs for efficient locomotion across open terrain, the high crowned teeth for processing the tough, silica-rich grass blades, and the larger body sizes that are advantageous in open habitats where thermoregulation is more challenging. By the Miocene, the horses were recognizably ancestral to the modern Equus lineage, large, single-toed, highly specialized grazers of open grassland. The bovids, the group that includes modern cattle, bison, sheep, goats, and their many relatives, diversified explosively in the Miocene in association with the grassland expansion, becoming one of the most successful and ecologically significant groups of large mammals in the history of the Cenozoic. The proboscideans, the group that includes the elephants and their extinct relatives, also diversified dramatically in the Miocene, with numerous species of varying body sizes and feeding adaptations radiating across the grasslands and forests of the Old World. The evolution of these large mammalian herbivore communities in the later Cenozoic created the ecological conditions for the development of large mammalian carnivore communities. The great cats, the canids, and the other large carnivore lineages of the modern world diversified in the Miocene and Pliocene in association with the diversification of their prey communities, each group evolving the morphological and behavioral specializations that allowed it to exploit specific prey types in specific ecological contexts. By the Pliocene, the mammalian carnivore fauna of the world included animals of impressive size and capability, though none of them approached the absolute size of the largest theropod dinosaurs. This narrative of gradual ecological rebuilding and diversification, from the sparse pioneer communities of the earliest Paleogene to the rich, diverse faunas of the Miocene and Pliocene, is one of the most important stories in the history of life on Earth. It is a story that demonstrates the extraordinary capacity of biological systems to recover from catastrophic disruption, to rebuild complexity from simplified foundations, to generate new diversity in the context of new ecological opportunities. But it is also a story that demonstrates how long that process of recovery takes, measured not in years or decades, but in millions of years, and how different the world that emerges from a catastrophic extinction is from the world that preceded the catastrophe. The world of the Miocene was not the world of the late Cretaceous restored. It was a fundamentally different world, with different dominant groups of organisms, different ecological architectures, different patterns of biogeography and ecological connectivity. The Cretaceous world had been organized around the ecological dominance of the non-avian dinosaurs, with their specific patterns of herbivory and predation shaping the plant communities and the food webs in ways that reflected 160 million years of coevolution. The Miocene world was organized around the ecological dominance of the mammals and the advanced birds, with their own specific patterns of ecological interaction, shaping the biosphere in ways that reflected 60 million years of post-extinction diversification. Neither world was better than the other in any objective sense. Both were products of their evolutionary history, both were richly diverse and ecologically complex, both were functioning biological systems of remarkable sophistication and resilience. But they were different, and the difference between them was the product of the catastrophe, the 66-million-year-old catastrophe that had deleted one version of complex life on Earth and replaced it with another. The fossil record that documents this transition from the world of the dinosaurs to the world of the mammals is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of science. It has been assembled over 2 centuries of paleontological investigation, from fossil beds scattered across every continent, from the badlands of the western interior of North America to the Fayum Depression of Egypt, from the Gobi Desert of Mongolia to the phosphate deposits of Morocco, from the coalfields of Europe to the fluvial sediments of Patagonia. Each of these sites has contributed pieces of the puzzle. Each has added details to our understanding of how life on Earth was reorganized in the aftermath of the greatest catastrophe in the history of complex land life. The process of assembling this puzzle has not been without controversy and complexity. The paleontological record is incomplete, inevitably, because fossilization is a rare and unpredictable process, and the organisms that are most likely to leave fossil records are not necessarily representative of the full diversity of life in any given time and place. Small, soft-bodied, and rare organisms are systematically underrepresented in the fossil record compared to large, hard-bodied, abundant organisms. This bias means that our understanding of the past is shaped partly by what actually existed and partly by what was likely to be preserved and found, and these two things are not identical. Despite these limitations, the fossil record of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary and the subsequent Paleogene recovery is rich enough to support firm conclusions about the broad pattern of extinction and recovery, even if many of the details remain uncertain or contentious. The firmest of these conclusions is the most important one. The end Cretaceous extinction was abrupt, catastrophic, and caused primarily by the impact of a large extraterrestrial body at the Chicxulub site on the Yucatan Peninsula approximately 66 million years ago. The extinction destroyed a richly diverse, thriving world of dinosaurian ecological dominance and opened the way for the subsequent diversification of the mammals and birds into the ecological roles that characterize the modern terrestrial fauna. But we should not leave the story of the Deccan traps entirely unaddressed, because the question of volcanic contributions to the end Cretaceous extinction is one that continues to generate scientific discussion, and that adds nuance to the simple impact story. The Deccan traps, a massive volcanic province in what is now the Indian subcontinent, were erupting during the same general time period as the Chicxulub impact, producing enormous quantities of lava and releasing large amounts of volcanic gases, including carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other compounds, into the atmosphere over a period of hundreds of thousands of years. Volcanic episodes of this magnitude, known as large igneous province events, have been implicated in other mass extinction events in Earth's history. The end Permian extinction, the largest mass extinction in the history of complex life, which occurred approximately 252 million years ago and eliminated more than 90% of marine species, is associated with the eruption of the Siberian traps, a large igneous province of similar scale to the Deccan traps. The coincidence of the Deccan trap volcanism with the end Cretaceous extinction has therefore led some researchers to suggest that volcanic contributions may have played a role in the extinction, either independently of the impact or in combination with it. The current scientific consensus, developed through careful geochronological work that has precisely dated both the Deccan Trap eruptions and the Chicxulub impact, suggests a complex picture. The Deccan eruptions were underway before the impact, and they may have caused some environmental stress to the late Cretaceous biosphere before the asteroid arrived. There is some evidence, though it remains debated, that the eruptions may have intensified in the aftermath of the impact, possibly triggered or enhanced by the seismic energy of the impact. And the volcanic gases continued to be released into the atmosphere in the aftermath of the impact, potentially contributing to the prolonged environmental instability of the post-impact period. But the weight of the evidence continues to support the Chicxulub impact as the primary driver of the mass extinction. The timing of the extinction, which the most precise available dating suggests was essentially synchronous with the impact rather than with any particular phase of the Deccan volcanism, argues for the impact as the decisive event. The specific chemical signatures preserved in boundary sections around the world, the iridium anomaly, the shocked quartz, the glass spherules, are consistent with an impact origin and not with a volcanic origin. And the abruptness of the extinction, the dramatic and near simultaneous disappearance of so many different groups of organisms across so many different environments, is more consistent with the rapid, globally distributed environmental effects of a large impact than with the more gradual and geographically variable effects of volcanic emissions. The Deccan volcanism was almost certainly a complicating factor, adding to the environmental stress of the boundary interval and potentially influencing the pattern and rate of recovery in the aftermath of the extinction. But it was not by itself the cause of the end Cretaceous mass extinction. The cause was the asteroid. The massive, indifferent, astronomically determined collision of a 10 to 15 kilometer rock with the Earth's surface on a day 66 million years ago that would, for the organisms living through it, have been indistinguishable from the end of the world. Let us now turn our attention to what the story of the end Cretaceous extinction tells us about the broader patterns of life's history on Earth. Because the Chicxulub impact and the mass extinction it caused are not isolated events in the history of life. They are part of a larger pattern, a pattern of periodic catastrophic extinction events that have punctuated the history of complex life on Earth at irregular intervals, each one devastating in its immediate effects and each one, in its long-term consequences, opening new evolutionary opportunities that have driven the subsequent diversification of life in new directions. The history of complex animal life on Earth, from the Cambrian explosion approximately 540 million years ago to the present day, has been punctuated by 5 major mass extinction events in which a significant fraction of all species on Earth disappeared within a geologically short period of time. The end Ordovician extinction, approximately 445 million years ago, eliminated approximately 85% of marine species. The late Devonian extinction, approximately 375 million years ago, eliminated approximately 75% of species. The end Permian extinction, approximately 252 million years ago, the greatest of all the mass extinctions, eliminated more than 90% of marine species and approximately 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. The end Triassic extinction, approximately 201 million years ago, eliminated approximately 80% of species. And the end Cretaceous extinction, 66 million years ago, eliminated approximately 76% of all species. Each of these 5 major extinction events was followed by a period of recovery and diversification in which the surviving lineages radiated into the ecological spaces left vacant by the extinct groups, and in which new kinds of organisms, with new biological designs and new ecological capabilities, emerged to fill roles that had not previously existed. The end Permian extinction was followed by the Triassic recovery, during which the dinosaurs and their relatives rose to ecological dominance. The end Triassic extinction cleared the way for the diversification of the dinosaurs into the full range of ecological roles they would occupy in the Jurassic and Cretaceous. And the end Cretaceous extinction cleared the way for the diversification of the mammals into the full range of ecological roles they occupy in the modern world. This pattern of catastrophic extinction followed by recovery and diversification has been described by some scientists as a ratchet mechanism in the history of life, a process in which periodic catastrophes reset the ecological stage, clearing it of its established occupants and allowing new groups to diversify in ways that would not have been possible if the previous occupants had persisted. Whether this is the right way to think about the pattern is debatable, because it risks giving the impression that the extinctions were in some sense good or necessary for the long-term progress of life, a conclusion that is both scientifically and philosophically problematic. The extinctions were catastrophes, full stop. They destroyed magnificently complex and successful biological worlds. Whatever good came of them was a consequence, not a purpose. But the observation that major extinctions have been followed by major diversification events is undeniably accurate and undeniably important for understanding the history of life. It tells us that the evolutionary process is not a simple, smooth accumulation of diversity and complexity over time. It is a process punctuated by catastrophic resets, events that suddenly delete large fractions of the existing diversity and create new evolutionary opportunities for the survivors. The world of the present day is the product of this punctuated process, shaped not only by the gradual accumulation of evolutionary innovation over billions of years, but also by the specific catastrophes that have periodically cleared the stage and redirected the trajectory of life's evolution. The end Cretaceous extinction is particularly significant in this context because it is the most recent of the 5 major mass extinctions, and because its immediate consequences, the world of the Cenozoic that followed it, is the world from which the present biological world has developed. The mammals and birds that dominate the modern terrestrial fauna, the flowering plants that dominate the modern vegetation, the ecological communities that we recognize as the natural world of our own time, all of these are products of the Cenozoic recovery from the end Cretaceous catastrophe. Understanding the end Cretaceous extinction is therefore not just a matter of historical interest. It is fundamental to understanding the biological world we inhabit today. The study of the end Cretaceous extinction has also had important implications for our understanding of the mechanisms that can cause mass extinctions and for our ability to assess the risks of future extinction events. The demonstration that a large extraterrestrial impact can cause a global mass extinction was a revelation when it was first proposed by the Alvarez team in 1980, and it transformed the way scientists think about the relationship between the Earth and the rest of the solar system. The Earth is not an isolated system, protected from the rest of the universe by its position in the solar system and its protective atmosphere. It is a target, one that has been hit by large impactors multiple times in its history, with consequences that range from minor to globally catastrophic, depending on the size of the impactor. The recognition of this impact threat, grounded in the scientific understanding of what the Chicxulub impact did to the Earth 66 million years ago, has driven the development of programs to catalog near-Earth objects, the asteroids and comets whose orbits bring them close enough to the Earth to pose a potential impact threat. This scientific and technological response to the lessons of the Chicxulub impact represents one of the most direct practical applications of paleontological knowledge to contemporary concerns, a translation of deep-time understanding into real-world risk assessment and mitigation planning. The Chicxulub impact has also had important implications for astrobiology, the study of the potential for life elsewhere in the universe. The recognition that a large body impact can cause a global mass extinction raises profound questions about the role of impact events in the evolution of life on any planet where complex organisms have developed. If large impacts have been periodic features of the Earth's geological history, as the crater record clearly demonstrates, then similar impact events must be expected features of the geological history of any rocky planet in any planetary system. The conditions under which life can develop and sustain itself on a rocky planet are therefore conditioned by the impact history of that planet, and any assessment of the habitability of other worlds must take into account the potential for impact-driven extinction events. But let us return from these broader implications to the specific story we have been telling, because there is more to say about the recovery from the end Cretaceous extinction, and about what it tells us concerning the nature of life's history and the processes that have shaped the biological world of the present day. One of the most important and most frequently misunderstood aspects of the end Cretaceous extinction is the question of what precisely makes a group of organisms resilient enough to survive a mass extinction event. We have already discussed the general principle that small body size and ecological generalism are advantageous in the post-impact world of severely depleted resources and extreme environmental instability. But the pattern of survival across the end Cretaceous boundary is more nuanced than this simple principle suggests, and understanding the nuances helps us appreciate the specific biological characteristics that determine survival and extinction for different groups. Consider the case of the crocodilians. Modern crocodiles and alligators are large animals, some of them substantially larger than any mammal alive today. They are not small, generalist opportunists in the way that the surviving mammals were, yet they survived the end Cretaceous extinction, and they have persisted with relatively little change to the present day, more than 66 million years later. How did they manage this when the similarly sized and similarly ecological non-avian dinosaurs did not? The answer lies partly in the specific physiological characteristics of crocodilians that make them extraordinarily resilient to conditions of food scarcity. Crocodilians are ectothermic, meaning that their body temperature is regulated by external sources of heat rather than by internal metabolic heat generation. This means that their metabolic rate is variable and can be dramatically reduced in conditions of low temperature or food scarcity. A crocodilian can go for months without eating by drastically reducing its metabolic rate, entering a state of reduced activity in which its energy requirements fall to a tiny fraction of what they would be during normal active conditions. This physiological flexibility gave crocodilians an enormous advantage in the post-impact world, where food resources had been catastrophically reduced, and where the ability to survive extended periods without adequate food was the difference between life and death. Crocodilians also benefit from a semi-aquatic lifestyle that placed them in aquatic environments, which, as we noted earlier, retained more biological resources through the post-impact period than the most severely affected terrestrial environments. The rivers and lakes and coastal wetlands in which crocodilians lived were not unaffected by the catastrophe, but they were less severely depleted than the open terrestrial landscape, and the detritus-based aquatic food chains that operated in them provided food resources that were more persistent through the period of darkness than the plant-based terrestrial food chains. The turtles present a similar case. Turtles are among the most long-lived and physiologically resilient of all vertebrates, capable of enduring extended periods of food scarcity through metabolic reduction and through the mobilization of stored fat reserves accumulated during periods of plenty. Their ectothermic physiology gives them the same advantage as the crocodilians in conditions of food scarcity, and their semi-aquatic or fully aquatic habits place many of them in the same relatively resource-rich aquatic environments that sheltered the crocodilians. The lizards and snakes, similarly, are ectothermic, small to medium in body size, and capable of exploiting a very wide range of food sources. Their diversity of diet and their physiological resilience made them capable of surviving the post-impact period in reduced but viable populations, and they subsequently diversified in the early Paleogene into the rich and diverse reptile fauna that exists today. The birds, as we have already discussed, survived through a combination of small body size, high metabolic flexibility, dietary generalism in the surviving lineages, and the ability to fly in search of food resources across the disrupted landscape. But the birds also benefited from another biological characteristic that we have not yet emphasized: the structure of their eggs and the efficiency of their reproductive strategy. Bird eggs, like the eggs of the non-avian dinosaurs from which birds descended, are enclosed in hard shells and can be incubated outside the body of the parent, with relatively modest parental investment compared to the gestation strategies of the placental mammals. This reproductive strategy, combined with the relatively rapid development of bird chicks compared to the offspring of many other vertebrate groups, gave the birds the ability to rebuild populations quickly after mortality events, a crucial advantage in the boom and bust conditions of the post-impact world. The mammals present a more complex picture. The placental mammals, with their internal gestation and their high parental investment in each offspring, might seem at first glance to be disadvantaged compared to egg-laying reptiles in the post-impact world. But the high parental investment of placental mammals translates into offspring that are at birth more developed and more capable of independent activity than the hatchlings of egg-laying reptiles. And the physiological characteristics of mammals, including endothermy, the ability to generate internal body heat and maintain a constant high body temperature, while energetically expensive under normal conditions, provided advantages in the thermally unstable post-impact environment that ectothermy did not. The ability of mammals to maintain a constant internal temperature independent of external conditions meant that they could remain active across a wider range of environmental temperatures than the ectothermic reptiles. In an environment where temperature was fluctuating wildly, between the extreme cold of the impact winter and the subsequent warming from elevated carbon dioxide, the mammals could continue to forage and to reproduce while the ectothermic reptiles were forced into torpor by cold conditions. This capacity for activity across a wide temperature range was, in the post-impact world, a significant advantage. The pattern of survival and extinction across the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary therefore reflects not a single, simple rule, but a complex interaction of multiple biological and ecological characteristics, each of which conferred advantages or disadvantages depending on the specific conditions of the post-impact world. Small body size helped, ecological generalism helped, ectothermic physiology helped in some contexts and hindered in others. Aquatic or semi-aquatic habits helped, dormancy capabilities helped, high reproductive rates helped. Each of these characteristics interacted with the specific sequence and duration of the post-impact environmental stresses in complex ways that determined, at the level of individual species and populations, who survived and who perished. This complexity is important to emphasize because it counteracts the tendency to view the end Cretaceous extinction as a simple story with a simple moral. The moral is not simply that large animals are doomed in catastrophic times and small animals are saved. The moral is not that specialization is dangerous and generalism is safe. The moral is that the survivors of a catastrophic extinction are the organisms whose specific biological characteristics happen to match the specific demands of the post-catastrophe environment, and that this match is determined by the specifics of both the catastrophe and the biology of the organisms, not by any simple general rule. This has an important implication for how we think about the survivors and their evolutionary legacy. The mammals and birds that survived the end Cretaceous extinction and went on to dominate the Cenozoic world were not the survivors because they were inherently superior to the dinosaurs they replaced. They were the survivors because their specific biological characteristics, developed over their own long evolutionary histories in the ecological margins of the Cretaceous world, happened to confer the specific kind of resilience needed to survive the specific kind of catastrophe that the Chicxulub impact produced. A different kind of catastrophe might have produced a different set of survivors, and the world we live in today would be profoundly different as a result. This contingency, the dependence of evolutionary outcomes on the specific historical circumstances in which they unfold, is one of the deepest and most important insights that the study of the fossil record and the history of life provides. Life on Earth is not the inevitable product of a deterministic evolutionary process that would produce the same result from the same starting conditions. It is the product of a process that is deeply contingent on historical accidents, on the specific sequence of events, including catastrophic events like the Chicxulub impact, that have shaped the Earth's physical and biological environment through time. Change any one of those historical events, and the trajectory of life's evolution would have been different. Remove the Chicxulub asteroid from Earth's orbital neighborhood, and 66 million years ago, the non-avian dinosaurs would have continued their ecological dominance, and the mammals would have remained the small, nocturnal, ecologically marginal creatures they had been throughout the Cretaceous. The world today, had the asteroid not arrived, would be dominated by the descendants of the dinosaurs, not by the descendants of the small insectivorous mammals that huddled in their burrows and dens through the long darkness of the impact winter. This thought experiment is not idle speculation. It has genuine scientific value because it highlights the role of contingency in evolution and the degree to which the specific biological composition of the modern world is the product of specific historical accidents rather than of some inevitable developmental trajectory. And it has a kind of philosophical resonance as well, because it reminds us that the world we live in, the world that we take for granted as the natural order of things, is in fact the product of a catastrophe. A catastrophe that destroyed one magnificent version of biological reality and replaced it, over millions of years, with another. The world of the mammals and the flowering plants and the diverse bird fauna is not the world as it was always destined to be. It is the world as it happened to become, as a consequence of an asteroid impact that occurred on a specific day 66 million years ago. As we consider the long recovery from the end Cretaceous extinction and the gradual rebuilding of ecological complexity in the Cenozoic, there is one more dimension of the story that deserves careful attention: the question of what is preserved in the modern world as a legacy of the dinosaurian world that was lost, because the age of dinosaurs did not simply end and disappear without a trace. It left legacies in the modern world that are, once you know how to see them, visible everywhere. The most obvious legacy, of course, is the birds. The approximately 10,000 species of birds alive today are the surviving descendants of the theropod dinosaurs, and their biology, their anatomy, their behavior, and their ecology all carry the marks of their dinosaurian heritage. The feathers that insulate a bird and power its flight are evolved versions of the feathers that we now know many theropod dinosaurs possessed. The high metabolism and constant body temperature that allow birds to be active in a wide range of environmental conditions are characteristics inherited from their theropod ancestors. The complex social behaviors of many bird species, their territorial calling, their elaborate courtship displays, their cooperative breeding in some species, are behavioral traditions whose roots extend back into the social lives of their dinosaurian ancestors. When you hear a bird singing in the early morning, or watch a hawk riding a thermal above an open landscape, or observe the precise, efficient movements of a heron stalking fish in shallow water, You are observing a living dinosaur, a representative of the most successful and diverse lineage of dinosaurian animals that the long history of dinosaur evolution produced. The birds are not analogs or substitutes for the dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs, the avian branch of the dinosaurian family tree, the survivors of the catastrophe that eliminated all the other branches. Beyond the birds, there are more subtle legacies of the dinosaurian world in the modern biosphere. The flowering plants, which diversified in association with the dinosaurian herbivore communities of the Cretaceous, carry in their biology the marks of their Cretaceous evolutionary history. The specific features of many modern flowering plant species, their flower structures, their fruit shapes and sizes, their seed dispersal mechanisms, were shaped in part by the ecological relationships they had with the animals of the Cretaceous and early Cenozoic, including the dinosaurian herbivores. The world of flowering plants that we know today is, in some sense, the evolutionary legacy of those ancient ecological relationships. The structure of terrestrial ecosystems, the basic architecture of food webs with their layers of producers, herbivores, and predators, the ecological roles that are filled by different groups of organisms, the patterns of predator-prey coevolution that shape the adaptations of both hunters and hunted. All of these reflect patterns that were established or refined during the long age of dinosaurian dominance and that have persisted with modifications through the Cenozoic and into the present. The ecological world we live in is, in its fundamental organization, a continuation of the ecological world of the Cretaceous, restructured around different organisms but operating according to the same basic principles. The geological record itself is a legacy of the dinosaurian world. The sedimentary rocks that preserve the dinosaur fossils, the ancient soils and river deposits and coastal plain sediments that accumulated during the Cretaceous, are part of the physical fabric of the Earth's surface. The oil and gas fields that underlie large parts of the modern world are in many cases the products of ancient organic matter, including the bodies of Cretaceous marine organisms, transformed over millions of years into petroleum by geological processes. The physical and chemical composition of the Earth's crust and sedimentary cover reflects billions of years of geological and biological history, including the Cretaceous epoch and the extraordinary organisms that lived during it. And the extinction event itself, the Chicxulub impact, left a legacy in the physical world that is preserved in the geological record wherever rocks of the right age are exposed. The thin clay layer with its chemical anomalies, the shocked quartz and glass spherules, the iridium enrichment, all of these are physical records of the catastrophe that ended the age of dinosaurs, preserved in rock and accessible to scientific investigation anywhere in the world where the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is exposed. They are, in a sense, the scar of the catastrophe, written permanently into the geological record of the planet. As we approach the end of our exploration of this extraordinary story, it is worth reflecting on the broader meaning of what we have learned. The story of the end Cretaceous extinction is, at one level, a story of catastrophic loss. The loss of a biological world of extraordinary richness and complexity, the loss of organisms that had been shaped by hundreds of millions of years of evolution into magnificent expressions of biological possibility, the loss of ecological relationships and evolutionary traditions that had no successors and left no direct descendants except in the birds. This loss was real and profound, and it deserves to be acknowledged as such. But the story is also, at another level, a story of the extraordinary resilience and creativity of the biological process itself. Life did not end at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. It was drastically simplified, its complexity dramatically reduced, its diversity cut down to a fraction of what it had been. But it survived, and in surviving, it began the process of rebuilding, of diversification, of the generation of new complexity from simple foundations. The Cenozoic era, the 66 million years from the end of the Cretaceous to the present day, is the story of that rebuilding, and it is a story of remarkable biological achievement, of the generation of a biological world that is, by many measures, as rich and complex and diverse as the world that preceded the catastrophe. The modern world, for all its differences from the Cretaceous world, is not a diminished world. It is a different world, a world shaped by different evolutionary histories, organized around different groups of organisms, structured by different ecological relationships. The diversity of modern mammals, with their extraordinary range of body sizes, dietary habits, social structures, and ecological roles, is a biological achievement of the first order. The diversity of modern birds, the most species-rich class of terrestrial vertebrates on the planet, is equally remarkable. The diversity of modern flowering plants, with their astonishing variety of forms and their ecological relationships with an equally astonishing variety of animal partners, is one of the greatest expressions of biological creativity that the evolutionary process has generated. This modern world was built on the ruins of the Cretaceous world. It was built by the survivors of the greatest catastrophe in the history of complex life on land, organisms that survived not because they were the best or the most sophisticated or the most ecologically accomplished, but because they happened to have the specific biological characteristics that allowed them to endure the specific conditions of the post-impact world. From these survivors, over 66 million years of evolution in a changing world, came everything that lives on land today. The dinosaurs, for all their magnificence, for all the extraordinary complexity of the ecological world they built and inhabited, are gone. Their bones lie in the rock, preserved as fossils in a widening network of sedimentary layers around the world, accessible to paleontologists with picks and brushes and chemical analysis, but inaccessible to the living world in any direct sense. They are the past, magnificent and irrecoverable, but their story is not simply a story of loss. It is a story of transformation, of a world that was, in geological terms, suddenly deleted and replaced by a different world, of the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible resilience of the biological process in the face of catastrophic challenge, of the ways in which even the most devastating disruption to the fabric of life on Earth ultimately becomes the foundation on which new complexity and new diversity are built, of the profound truth that extinction is not simply an ending. It is also, over the long arc of geological time, a beginning, a painful, catastrophic, irreversible beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. The great dinosaurs walked this planet for 160 million years. They filled it with their presence, their sounds, their ecological relationships, their evolutionary innovations. They built a biological world of extraordinary richness, and then, in what amounts to a single moment in the vast sweep of Earth's history, they lost it. Not because they failed, not because they were inferior to what replaced them, but because a rock fell from the sky. And in the silence that followed, in the dark and the cold and the ruin of a world, the survivors began the slow, patient, extraordinary work of building something new from the wreckage, something that 66 million years later we can look at and call the living world. The world of mammals and birds and flowering plants and complex ecosystems built on foundations that stretch back, through all the layers of deep time, to the catastrophe that created them by destroying what came before. The story of the dinosaurs is the story of life itself, vast, complex, magnificent, and ultimately vulnerable to the random violence of a universe that cares nothing for the extraordinary things that happen on the surface of one small planet, circling one ordinary star, in one corner of one galaxy among billions. Life on Earth has survived that indifference again and again through resilience and adaptability, and the sheer, stubborn, tenacious persistence of the biological process in the face of every challenge the universe has thrown at it. That persistence, that extraordinary capacity to survive and rebuild and diversify and create new complexity from the ruins of the old, is perhaps the most important thing that the story of the dinosaurs and their extinction has to teach us. Not about the dinosaurs specifically, but about the nature of life itself. about what it means for living things to exist in a universe that is, at the cosmic scale, utterly indifferent to their existence, and yet to persist and flourish and build worlds of extraordinary beauty and complexity, again and again and again, across the vast depths of geological time. The story of the final days of the great dinosaurs is not ultimately a story of ending. It is a story of transformation. Of the catastrophic destruction of one magnificent version of the world, and the slow, painful, extraordinary creation of another. The world we live in is the inheritor of that transformation, built on foundations of deep time and catastrophe and recovery, shaped by the specific accidents of a history that could have unfolded in 1,000 different ways and happened to unfold in this one. We are the products of that history. The living world around us is the product of that history. And every fossil bone of every dinosaur that a paleontologist uncovers from the ancient rock is a message from that history, a fragment of the extraordinary story of life on Earth, encoded in calcium phosphate and silica, waiting to be read and understood and marveled at, for as long as there are minds capable of appreciation and the patience to look deeply into the past. The dinosaurs are gone, but they are not forgotten. And their story, written in the rock of the planet they once ruled, continues to speak to anyone willing to listen to the deep, resonant voice of geological time. A voice that tells us, in the language of fossil and stone and chemical signature, that life on Earth is more resilient, more creative, more extraordinary, and more contingent than we might ever have imagined. And that the world we live in, for all its familiarity and all its beauty, is the improbable, catastrophe-born, endlessly remarkable product of 66 million years of recovery from the day the sky fell on the age of dinosaurs.